Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1: The Memory of Small Hands. My name is Rachel Miller, and I live in a remote countryside in the state of Maine, where endless pine forests stretch for miles, and the howling of wolves at night is just another familiar part of life. After my father died of a stroke last winter, I decided to move into the old cabin he left behind, along with my 8-year-old son, Liam, to escape the suffocating pace of life in Boston. The house sits quietly in a misty valley, each morning surrounded by miles of woodland and only a few neighbors scattered half a mile down the dirt road. It has a peacefulness to it, but also a loneliness that creeps into your bones. I once thought this place would help us heal, both me and Liam, who had been having nightmares ever since his grandfather's funeral. We moved in at the end of September, when the maple leaves were turning and night fell faster. Everything was fine at first, except Liam kept saying his upstairs bedroom had a rustling sound at night. I didn't think much of it. Kids have imaginations. But by the second week, I realized I had made a terrible mistake not paying closer attention. It was Tuesday night. I was folding laundry when Liam ran into the room, eyes wide, face pale. He whispered, "Mom, there's a door in my room." I paused. "A door? What do you mean, a window?" "No, a small door, right on the wall at the end of my bed. It wasn't there this morning." I went with him to his room. On the wall opposite the bed, which had always just been a flat wooden panel, there was now a tiny door, no taller than an adult's knee, sitting flush against the floor. The wood was dark, aged, as if it had been there for decades. But I knew it hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. I tried to open it. It was locked. No handle, no visible hinges, as if it had been sealed forever. I told Liam it was probably just some old storage hatch his grandpa had left behind, then pulled the bed away to hide it. But later that night, while I was reading in my room, I heard something, a faint clack, then the groan of wood on rusted hinges. I rushed into Liam's room. He was asleep, but when I looked toward the end of his bed, my blood went cold in the stillness of night. The door, it was ajar. Just a sliver, but enough for me to see. Something move inside, like a hand, small, very small. That night I pulled Liam into my room to sleep with me. I locked the bedroom door. The second night, the door creaked open again. I stuffed newspaper into the crack, but by morning it was torn to shreds, as if clawed apart by tiny nails. Liam started changing. He spoke less. Every time I asked if he had any dreams, he'd just shake his head and stare at the wall behind his bed. I had heard that children could sense things adults couldn't. I was beginning to believe that. Thursday, I came back from the grocery store and found smudged handprints in the dust on the upstairs floor. Small, like a newborn's. Dirty, smeared, as if dragged. I called the police. Deputy Daniels came, an old man with nearly white hair, a former friend of my dad's. "Rachel, are you sure no one broke in? No windows broken, no sign of forced entry." I took him to Liam's room. The small door was closed. I pointed to it. He squinted. strange. I don't remember this house having anything like that. I helped your father renovate this whole floor back in '96. It's always just been a plain wall. I shivered. Mind if I try to open it? He asked. I nodded. He used a knife to pry at the seams. Behind the wooden door was nothing. Just a black void. A deep, hollow space. Like a tunnel cut into the wall. When he shone his flashlight in, the beam only traveled a few feet before vanishing. Could be an empty space between the insulation panels, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Then he gave a weak chuckle. Maybe mice. That night I heard laughter, high-pitched, shrill, like a 3-year-old child giggling. It came from Liam's room, from behind the little door. It laughed 3 times, then fell silent. I turned on the light and ran to his room. Liam was asleep, but his bed was pushed away from the wall, like something had shoved it. I woke him up and packed a few things. We slept on the downstairs couch that night. I no longer believed this was someone's prank. No one could crawl through a door that small. And no one could fake that laugh. Not like that. No echo. No human resonance. That was night 6. Saturday morning, I called the town's church pastor, Father Gerald. A kind man, always telling jokes, always carrying a weathered Bible with him. When I told him about the door, he went quiet for a long time. Rachel, do you remember what happened here in 1988? I shook my head. There was a disappearance. A child, the son of the previous couple who lived here. They said he went to bed and vanished in the middle of the night. The police never found a body. My blood ran cold. You mean that child might still be here? No, but whatever took him might be. That night was the 7th night. The door didn't just open a crack, it swung wide. And I heard tiny footsteps circling the bed, each step soft but deliberate. I lay still, barely breathing. Liam clung to me under the blanket, his body trembling. The steps stopped at the head of the bed. Then I felt the blanket being pulled down slightly, as if something was peeking in. Then a hand, small, gray, ice cold, touched my cheek. I didn't scream. I couldn't. There was only the sound of wind hissing at the window and laughter echoing from inside the wall. I didn't sleep at all that night. That ice-cold hand, that faint touch, it wasn't something I could explain with logic or science. It couldn't belong to anyone still living. And the footsteps, the way they circled around my bed, made me feel like a child was playing tag with my sanity. As the sky began to lighten, I jumped up, grabbed Liam, and locked the upstairs bedroom behind us. I couldn't let my son stay in that house another minute. We left at 6:30 in the morning and drove to stay with my best friend, Andrea, who lived nearly 30 miles away. I didn't tell her the whole truth. How could I explain a door that appears from nowhere, opens every night, revealing a small, unfamiliar child's hand? How could I say that I felt it touch my skin, as if it were trying to memorize me? I only told Andrea that something felt wrong, that the house showed unsafe signs. She's the type who believes in energy, spirits, and the supernatural. She didn't ask many questions, only advised me to call someone experienced to come and take a look. That's why I called Claire, a woman who specializes in home cleansing rituals. Someone Andrea had once asked for help when she had trouble with her old apartment. Claire arrived that afternoon, carrying a large canvas bag filled with strange items. A bucket of ash bundles of white sage, tiny brass wind chimes, and a thick, nameless black book. "I've seen things like this before," Claire said, her voice soft like wind brushing dried leaves. "But it's rare when it involves children." I brought her to the house just before dusk. Before stepping inside, Claire paused on the porch. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "There's something here, something old, not from this era." We started in the living room, then moved down the hallway, where she sprinkled ash and burned the sage, letting thin gray smoke trail through the air. But when we reached the stairs, the atmosphere changed abruptly. I couldn't describe it exactly, only that the temperature dropped, like someone had opened a freezer door in the middle of the hallway. Claire stopped. "Do you see something?" I asked. "Something was summoned, but not by you," she replied, clutching the chain of... I don't remember when I finally drifted off after that hand touched my face, or exactly how I managed to sleep. When I opened my eyes, the pale light of dawn streamed in through the window, as if the night before had been just a bad dream. But the mark was still there, the faint, dirty handprint on the bed sheets, the small scratches on my neck that I couldn't have caused myself. Liam woke up later than usual. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He didn't cry, didn't complain, just sat quietly, as if something inside him had broken. I decided to take him out of the house for a few days. I needed time to figure things out, or at least give my son a break. But as I packed the suitcase, Liam suddenly appeared at the bedroom door, his gaze fixed on the wall behind the bed. "Mom, the door's closed again," he said, his voice hoarse. I turned around. The small door was now shut tight, as if it had never been opened. But the scratch marks around the wooden frame, as if something had tried to climb out or been shoved back in, were still there, deeply etched into the dark wood. We got in the car and drove to an old friend of my father's, Mr. Walter, who lived about 15 miles away. He was a retired carpenter, but he had helped my father with repairs in the 80s. When I told him about the door, Walter didn't laugh. He just sat quietly, gripping his coffee cup tightly. "Rachel, that house used to have a room beneath the floor, a small cellar your father had sealed up after the incident. He never talked much about it, just said, 'That place is never to be touched. Maybe the door you saw leads to that cellar.'" "A cellar?" My spine chilled. "You mean it's still there?" Walter nodded, his eyes staring off into the distance. "But it wasn't a normal cellar. People used to say when it was still open, you could hear children crying from inside every night, and that sound never stopped until your father had it sealed off." I wasn't sure whether I should believe him, but everything I had experienced wouldn't let me ignore any clue. That afternoon, after leaving Liam with Mr. Walter, I returned home alone. I needed to face the truth by myself. The sky was dark with clouds when I entered the house. The air inside was cold, strangely damp. Even though I had been gone for less than 10 hours, I went straight to the second floor. The small door was still silent, but as I stepped closer, I heard it. A soft knocking. 1, 2, 3 knocks. I bent down, pressing my ear to the door. A deep, long breath, as if someone was sitting just on the other side. Then a whisper, "Mom?" I jerked back, hitting the bed frame with my back. No, it wasn't Liam's voice. This voice was strange, childlike, but hollow, soulless. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, then turned back. I wasn't sure what I was thinking, but I couldn't let this continue. I used the knife to pry open the edge of the door, and it came off more easily than I expected. A cold breeze wafted out, bringing the smell of rotting earth and something rancid, like decaying flesh. Inside was a narrow tunnel, just wide enough for a child to crawl through, but deep and winding. I couldn't see the bottom, even with the flashlight. I tied a rope around my waist, the other end fastened to the bed leg, and slowly crawled in. The air in the tunnel was suffocating, thick as water. I crawled for about 10 meters before the wall opened into an empty chamber. A small room covered in cobwebs, the brick walls crumbling, and in the center was a child's crib. There was no one there, but on the crib was a doll. I moved closer. It wore a white dress, its curly hair tangled, its eyes wide open. But what made me shudder was its face. It wasn't like an ordinary doll. It looked exactly like a childhood photo of me that my mother used to keep. Beneath the doll was an old photograph, a family of 3. The mother's face was scratched out, and the child in the photo, its face was scribbled over with black ink, distorted to the point of being unrecognizable. I picked up the photo, but just then, I heard a noise behind me. The sound of something crawling. Quickly, I turned around. The flashlight wobbled. A creature crawled out from the wall's crevice, its limbs curled up like a newborn's, gray and damp skin, its eyes devoid of pupils. It opened its mouth. "Mom?" I scrambled to my feet, crawling back through the tunnel, my heart pounding. By the time I reached the room, I slammed the door shut and piled every piece of furniture in the room against it. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't dare close my eyes. The next morning, I took Liam and left the house. We moved to my sister's house in Portland for a few days. But then, the messages started coming. Not from an unknown number, but from the landline phone in my old house. The one I was sure I had unplugged months ago. The message had just 3 words, repeating over and over. "Mom, open the door." Story 2, The Haunted Doll. Knows who lies, I never believed in the supernatural until my daughter started talking to the doll. We moved into the house in suburban Springfield, Missouri on a damp March morning, hoping for a fresh start. The house wasn't old, rebuilt after a fire a decade ago. But the wood walls still carried the faint traces of soot, as if the fire had never been fully extinguished. I'm a single mother, Rachel, and my daughter Emily is 5 years old. On our first night, Emily found the doll. It was buried deep in a basement drawer, wrapped in a thin blanket, as though it had been hidden away. She picked it up, dusted it off, and giggled like it was an old friend. "I'll name her Daisy," Emily said, brushing the doll's tangled hair. Its eyes were made of dark glass, deep set, as if they could see inside others. I shuddered when I looked into them. The doll's face had a crack running from the temple to the cheek, like an old scar. That night I heard the whispers for the first time. The sound was faint, like wind slipping through a crack in the door, but clearly human. I thought it was Emily talking in her sleep, but when I entered her room, she was fast asleep. Daisy lay next to her, facing the wall. I turned the doll's head. When I touched it, my hand felt icy cold, as if I had placed it on a block of ice, even though the room was warm. I tried to reassure myself. It was just exhaustion from the move. But the next morning, Emily said, Daisy says someone in the house is hiding a secret. I laughed. What secret? She tilted her head. You know, Mama, Daisy doesn't like liars. I didn't think much of it. But as the days went on, things started to feel off. My cousin, Julie, came to stay with us for a few days. She was unemployed, divorced, and needed a place to stay. Julie was cheerful and outgoing, but I noticed she often went into Emily's room at night. Not to play, but to stare at the doll. One night, I woke to a short, strangled scream. I rushed into the living room. Julie was sitting on the floor, her eyes wide, pointing at Daisy. It turned its head to look at me. She whispered, "It knows." The next morning, Julie was gone. No note, no luggage, no trace. The police were called, but they assumed she had a history of mental health issues and had left voluntarily. I didn't believe that. Emily just stared at me and quietly said, "Daisy knows Julie stole money from you." I froze. I hadn't told anyone about the few $100 missing from my wallet 2 days ago. The following week, my brother Marcus came to visit. He was carefree, always joking around, and never took anything seriously. When I told him about Julie's disappearance, he laughed and went to Emily's room to mess with the doll. "I'm going to ask it if you've been reading my diary," Marcus joked. Emily coldly replied, "You shouldn't touch Daisy." Marcus ignored her and picked up the doll. During dinner, Daisy was left on the kitchen table. Suddenly, its head slowly turned toward Marcus, the movement accompanied by a squeaking sound like rusty hinges. I will never forget Marcus's face. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the doll, dropped his fork, and stood up, walking out. The next morning, I found Marcus's car parked a short distance from the house, door wide open, but the inside was empty. He had vanished. I started hearing footsteps at night. Occasionally, I'd hear a child's laughter echoing down the hallway. Emily still slept soundly, clutching Daisy every night. But I didn't. I saw shadows in the bathroom mirror. I heard someone call my name from downstairs, though no one was there. I hid Daisy, this time not in a drawer, but locked away in a carton outside the storage shed. I thought I had ended it. But that night, Emily stood in front of my bed at 3 a.m., eyes wide open, her face empty. "You hid Daisy," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. The doll doesn't like being betrayed. At the same time, I heard knocks downstairs. 4 knocks, evenly spaced, like a heartbeat. I went down, hands trembling, and opened the door. No one was there. Only the carton I had hidden Daisy in, now sitting on the porch. And the doll wasn't inside. It stood on the rocking chair, facing the house. I called an old friend, Holly, who had worked in crime investigation in Ohio, asking if she had ever heard of anything like this. Holly was silent for a long time, then whispered, "Daisy? You said its name is Daisy." I felt my blood freeze. "I investigated a case in 2013, Holly said. A little girl named Amanda went missing. Her mother claimed that the doll always whispered about the family's sins. The last person to disappear was the mother. I didn't know what to do. I watched my daughter every day, wondering how much of Emily was still left. I saw her standing alone in the dark, mouthing words that made no sense, her eyes staring off into the distance. And tonight, when I entered her room, Daisy was lying on the desk, facing the door where I stood. I heard the whisper. This time, it was my name I don't remember when I started walking. I only know that when I realized it, my feet were already on an old dirt road, stretching endlessly through a sparse forest. No lights, No houses, just the sound of leaves rustling above and a cold moon hanging loosely in the sky. This road, I had never seen it in daylight. It wasn't on any neighborhood map. It didn't connect to any public pathways. But that night, after a faint call from the forest, I found myself standing at the end of that narrow path before a half-closed rusty gate, as if placed there to block or lure someone into stepping further. It all started a few days after I cremated Daisy. I know I shouldn't have, but I was desperate. Emily started sleepwalking, her eyes wide open. She spoke in a language that Google couldn't translate. And Daisy, after coming back from the shed, was no longer a toy. I heard it laugh. I saw its eyes blink. And once, I'm sure, it lifted its head off the pillow when I entered the room. I personally placed it on the cremation furnace in the backyard, burning it until the plastic melted. Its hair bubbled and its body shriveled up like a real corpse. Emily stood at a distance, not crying. She only whispered, "Mom made a mistake." That night the road appeared. I walked as though pulled by an invisible string. Each step deeper into the path made a part of me contract with fear. But the whispers, they weren't Daisy's. It was like an invitation. Gentle, familiar, like my mother's voice, who had passed away when I was 10. "Rachel?" The voice echoed in the darkness. "You can't go back." I looked around. There was no one. The moonlight illuminated the trail, shining on something ahead. A small wooden house, its windows boarded up, the front door slightly ajar. On the wooden wall were handprints, tiny, like a child's, stained with something dry and dark. I froze. It was the house Emily had dreamed about. She told me about the house at the end of the road, where the girl who knows everything lives. The place where Daisy was born. The door creaked open as I pushed it gently. The smell of mildew, ash, and something foul, like rotting flesh, hit me, choking my breath. I turned on my flashlight. Inside was an old living room, dusty and scattered with old toys. On the floor, a circle drawn in black wax, and in the center, a small picture frame, crooked. I picked it up. A little girl, black hair, deep eyes, a face. Strangely familiar. For a few seconds, I thought her face was identical to Emily's, only older. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. I looked up. "Is anyone there?" No answer, only the sound of creaking wood, as if someone was moving slowly on the second floor. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking as if crying out for help. Upstairs was a hallway leading to a single door. I grabbed the handle and realized it was warm. I opened it. Inside was an old bed, blankets scattered around. The walls were covered in drawings of faceless people standing in a line, holding hands. In the middle of the room was a small table. On it, a doll, completely black, no hair, no face. I don't know why I touched it, but when I did, I heard a scream in my head. Emily's voice. "Mom, don't take it." I recoiled. The doll fell to the floor, but didn't make a sound. I turned to run, my heart pounding, down the stairs, through the living room. But when I pushed open the door, the road I had come from was no longer there. Only darkness, deep, endless, as though the house had been swallowed into another space. I couldn't go back. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time didn't flow like it should. I slept in the old house. I heard lullabies echoing from the second floor every night. I smelled burning hair. And sometimes I saw small hands pressed against the window from the outside. I found a journal hidden under the bed on the second floor. It belonged to a girl named Annabelle Jenkins, who lived here in 1992. The last page read, "Mom told me I have to keep a secret, but Daisy knows. And tonight, Daisy will tell everyone." At the bottom of the page was a brown smear and a tiny handprint. On the seventh night, I heard Emily's laughter through the wall. "Mom, play with me." I ran to the door and slammed it open. The darkness dissipated like smoke, and I collapsed. My face pressed into the cold dirt floor. I had returned to the road, but the house was gone. Only a patch of barren land and an old stone pillar remained with an inscription. "Don't go in when you hear the voice call. They died once and don't want to be alone." I went home, thinking everything was over. Emily was sitting in her room, staring off into space. "You met her, didn't you?" she asked. I held my breath. "Who?" "Annabelle," Emily smiled. "She said you've lied too, like Julie, like Uncle Marcus." I didn't know how to respond. I sat down and held her close. "You don't need Daisy anymore," I whispered. "You never needed Daisy," Emily replied. "Daisy was just a door." I froze. "A door to what?" She looked at me, eyes as dark as the faceless doll in the wooden house. "For things that can't lie." Since that night I returned from that road, I no longer saw Emily the same way. It wasn't because she changed too quickly. It was because I wasn't sure if the one living in my daughter's body was still Emily, standing in front of the bathroom mirror silently for a long time, as if she was trying to learn how to mimic her own face. Her hand traced her cheek, then her lips, then her eyes, slowly, as if applying a mask. Every time I asked, "What are you doing, Emily?" she would turn, smile, a smile that didn't belong to her age and didn't belong to her. I began recording at night, partly because I was worried about Emily sleepwalking, partly because I wanted to know if something was happening that I couldn't remember when I woke up. For the first 3 nights, all I heard was the steady whir of the ceiling fan, the steady breathing of both of us. But on the 4th night, the tape recorded the sound of a door opening at 3:12 a.m. The footsteps were light but steady, moving from Emily's bedroom across the hallway, then down to the kitchen. A long silence followed, then a lullaby in Old English. "Hush, little child, don't you cry. Mommy's gone and Daddy died." I shivered as I listened again. Emily had never known that song. Neither had I. I took the recording to Holly, an old friend who used to work in the forensics department. She frowned, listened to the entire tape, then spoke to me in a tone I had never heard from her before. "Rachel, I think this is not just sleepwalking or a hallucination." "What do you mean? That voice, it's not a child's voice." I froze. "Whose voice is it?" Holly was silent for a moment before answering. "A woman's, about 30 years old, but what's strange is the frequency. It's uneven, almost as if the voice was pieced together from multiple recordings, like someone is learning how to be human." I started looking through my mother's old journals, the notebooks hidden in a tin box in the attic, which I had avoided after my mother passed. My mother died in a car accident. At least that's what I was told when I was younger. But as I grew up, I began to feel that something wasn't right. Now I was certain. The last page of the 4th journal had scribbled, rushed writing. It chose Rachel. I can't stop it anymore. I thought keeping the secret would be enough, but the darkness always finds the weakest children in the flock. Rachel heard the call. "It is coming." At the bottom was a crude drawing. an exact map of the road I had walked that night. I showed the copy to Holly, telling her everything. Daisy, the cabin, the child, named Annabelle. She was silent for a long time, then suggested we meet someone. His name was Matson, a priest who had been excommunicated from the church over 10 years ago for performing unsanctioned exorcisms. He now lived in a small cabin near Table Rock Lake, about 3 hours' drive from Springfield. When I stepped into his house, the first thing I felt was the smell of damp wood and incense. Mr. Matson looked at me for a long time before saying something strange. "You've returned from the nameless land, but you've brought something that doesn't belong to you." I asked him if there was any way to save Emily. He shook his head. "It's too late. It doesn't need her body. It needs her identity." I didn't understand. There are entities that don't exist like ghosts or demons. They feed off memories. They feed off lies. Every time someone denies what they've done, it grows a little more. I froze. A lie. He stared at me. "You've been hiding something. Something that caused the death. It has sensed it." I didn't want to remember. But the memory returned, clawing at my mind. I was 11. My mother had warned me not to follow Uncle Joey, my older cousin, 3 years older than me, who lived with my grandmother on the other side of the street. But I went anyway, and we played a game of treasure hunt in the flooded old basement. It was just an accident. I pushed the steel door, and it slammed down on Joey's hand. I ran away, scared, panicked. Joey died from blood loss. I told my mother. I didn't know what happened. I kept that lie for over 20 years. Until now, I collapsed in Mr. Matson's house. My heart was racing, tears streaming down my face. "I killed someone," I whispered. "It's my fault." Mr. Matson nodded. "Then you have a chance. You must face this alone. You have to bring her back to the path. But this time, you won't return unless the truth is spoken." That night I took Emily out. She didn't resist. She didn't ask where we were going. She just walked silently beside me barefoot, stepping on the gravel, emotionless. The empty road appeared again when the clock struck 2:16 a.m. We walked into it, and I knew there would be no third time. I don't remember how far I walked. All I know is that when I turned around, the old world had vanished behind a thick veil of mist. There were no streetlights, no sounds, no noise but the footsteps of Emily and me, blending together, merging with the cold breath of the night. The path ahead was no longer the same. Now it curved, as if challenging us. On either side, there were no trees, but walls. I don't know when it happened, but 2 rows of cold gray stone walls rose, tall and imposing, with no windows, no cracks, pressing the path into a narrow passage, like the throat of a beast slowly swallowing us. Emily still walked beside me, silent, but I started to hear other sounds. A soft scraping on the stone walls, whispers mixed with heavy breathing. And every time I stopped, Emily stopped too. Every time I turned, she was already facing me, as if waiting for me. I began to doubt if that was even my daughter anymore. At the third bend, we encountered a door, not a wooden or metal door, but a curtain, black as coal, hanging suspended in the air. No frame, no string, as if someone had torn the fabric of space and left this curtain like a scar. Emily stepped forward, gently touching it. The curtain dissipated like smoke, revealing a room inside. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the living room of my mother's house, every detail perfect. The beige sofa, the clock on the wall stopped at 3:17. and the photo of me at age 10 placed neatly on the mantel. But in the corner of the room was a rocking chair, and someone was sitting there. Her, my mother. She slowly turned her head, her eyes black and her smile darker than any memory I ever had. "Come here, Rachel," she whispered. Emily didn't move. I stepped forward alone. "Mom, you're dead," I said, my voice trembling. "Death doesn't mean disappearing," she replied. "Death is just a new place to see old things. And you never wanted to look." I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. In front of me, my mother pointed to the corner of the room. I looked and saw myself, a small version about 10 years old, sitting with a pillow in my arms, eyes hollow, blood dripping from my left hand, the hand that had pushed the iron door down onto Joey. "This is where all lies go," my mother said, "and if you don't keep it here, it will find another place to live." I wanted to say something, but when I looked back, she was gone. The room disintegrated like ink bleeding out, and we were back on the cold stone path, the walls still high, but now with blood-stained handprints everywhere. Emily whispered, "You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I just held her hand and kept walking. A little while later, the path suddenly widened. Ahead of me was a barren field, the wind howling like a long, painful groan. In the middle of the field, a huge willow tree stood alone. The trunk was tightly bound with white cloth, like a shroud for the dead. On every branch hung wooden masks, smiling faces, crying faces, angry faces, empty faces, and beneath the tree was a well. Emily moved toward it. I screamed, "Don't get close," but she stood still, pointing at the well's edge. I approached and looked down. It wasn't water below. It was a mirror. The mirror reflected my face, but not the way I looked now. It was me at age 11, eyes swollen and terrified, blood covering my hands. Emily's voice echoed in my ear. "If you want to bring me back, you have to speak. Not just the truth, but everything." The mirror in the well began to ripple, and I understood. This was the challenge. I had to face the memories, the silence, and the spirit of Joey. I knelt down and said, not for Emily, but for myself. At that time, I didn't mean to. I was just playing. I didn't think the door would be that heavy. I was scared. I ran away. I lied to you. I left Joey there, blood soaking the cement floor, and I never came back. The wind stopped. The mirror shattered, and a deep gravelly voice echoed from the earth. "Well then, you've told the truth." A small bloodied hand reached up from the well. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't vengeful. It was just a touch. I took it. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in Emily's room. The clock read 6:01 a.m. Emily was sitting on the chair, holding a teddy bear, eyes wide open. "Mom's back," she whispered. I rushed over to hug her, warmth returning for the first time in weeks. No more whispers, no more darkness, no more Daisy. We had returned. But from that moment on, I never looked into a mirror at night. Because once, in a fleeting moment, I saw the 11-year-old standing behind me in the mirror, blood still staining her hands, and her eyes still unforgiven. Story 3. The death on page 33 of the diary. I never wanted to return to the house in Vermont, but I had no choice. After my grandfather's sudden death, the only family member I truly respected, the lawyer informed me that I was the sole heir to the old wooden house he left behind. My mother passed away when I was young, and my father, Well, he was never really a father. So, my grandfather was everything to me. But no matter how much I loved him, I couldn't shake the cold, eerie feeling every time I thought about the attic of his house. That place was always locked. He forbade me from ever going near it when I was little with a stern voice. If you ever see that door open, even just a crack, run. Don't look inside. I used to think he was just getting old and forgetful. But that night, the night I returned to the house after the funeral, I realized I had never truly known who my grandfather was. The ground floor was covered in dust, but it still held my grandfather's meticulous habits. The calendar was frozen on the day he died, his shoes neatly placed under the coat rack. I sat quietly in the living room, absent-mindedly twirling the old set of keys the lawyer gave me. There was one that seemed different from all the rest. A small, slightly curved key with a coppery patina, now turning green. I knew it was the key to the attic. And I knew I wouldn't be able to resist. At midnight, the rain began to pour. The wind slammed against the windows. In the howling wind, I thought I heard footsteps above my head. Light, slow, dragging. I thought it was my imagination. But then the attic door creaked open, even though I was sure I had locked it. The old attic stairs groaned under each step, the wood musty and damp, carrying the smell of rot and something like long-decayed flesh making my stomach turn. The weak beam of my flashlight swept over old dusty items. Metal boxes, broken chairs, a cracked mirror, portrait paintings with faces blurred out. But in the darkest corner, I saw a small table with a black leather-bound diary on top. The cover had no date, only a circular symbol carved in the center, like a PSI. Around it were dried wax stains and soot marks. When I opened it, I found neat handwriting at first. But as I flipped through the pages, the writing grew more erratic, shaky, as if trembling from fear. I flipped through, skimming over vague notes about voices in the night, light behind mirrors, and whispers beneath the floorboards. But then I stopped at page 33. It was sealed shut with a thick layer of red wax. Along the edge of the paper was a trembling sentence, written in red ink, almost scratched into the paper. Do not open unless you want to die. Something inside me, curiosity, stupidity, or both, urged me to pry the wax open. It was stuck tight, like it had been there for decades. When the wax finally came off, there were no words, only a photograph was stuck in the middle of the page. The photograph wasn't old or faded. It was clear, with unnervingly lifelike colors. It was me, looking directly at the camera, but my eyes were sewn shut with black thread. The skin around my eyes was swollen and red with dried bloodstains. I froze, dropping the diary to the floor. The photo landed face down, but when I bent to pick it up, I heard a light knock behind me. 3 knocks. It was definitely not the wind. I spun around, the flashlight aimed straight at one of the mirrors leaning in the corner of the room. And in the mirror, I saw myself. But the version in the mirror did not move in sync with me. I stood still, but it tilted its head. I raised my hand, and it was a beat slower. I screamed and backed away. The mirror cracked wide open, as if something from the inside was trying to break through. I ran out of the attic, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My heart was pounding in my chest, cold sweat dripping down the back of my neck. But when I looked down at my hands, the photo was still there. For some reason, I didn't throw it away. I didn't sleep the whole night. I heard whispers outside my door, silent sounds, like lullabies, but interrupted, distorted, with occasional scraping noises against the walls. The next morning, I went to see Dr. Alex, my grandfather's old friend, a retired psychiatrist. I showed him the diary. He didn't touch it. His face went pale when he saw the photograph. "Did you open page 33? He whispered. I nodded. He stood up and pulled out a small metal box from his drawer, filled with a series of photographs. Inside, I saw pictures of other people, but they all had one thing in common. Their eyes were sewn shut, their faces swollen. But there was a feeling they were still alive in the photo. "These are the people who held that diary," he whispered. "They all died, or disappeared. No one survived more than 33 days after opening page 33. I froze. Then why did my grandfather keep it? Alex looked at me, his eyes cloudy, because he was the only one who escaped, but he had to pay the price. I didn't ask him what the price was, because deep in my mind, I understood. I was about to find out. And the only question left was, would I survive to see day 34? I returned to my grandfather's house at night, just as the fog began to crawl down from the distant mountains. The dirt road leading into the forest was dry and gloomy, as if no one had walked through it in years. Inside the car, the photo of me with my eyes sewn shut still lay in the glove compartment. A silent reminder. I had turned to page 33, and there was no turning back. Alex's words kept echoing in my head. No one lasts more than 33 days after opening that page. I checked my phone. Day 3. Something unseen was getting closer. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it on my skin. Every time night fell, my flesh prickled, like thousands of eyes, stitched shut, watching me from behind walls, beneath the bed, from inside mirrors. I hadn't planned on going back to the attic, but that night, exactly at 2:33 a.m., I heard something fall onto the ceiling. It wasn't loud, not enough to alarm, but that soft thud, that was what jolted me upright, so distinct, so real. I grabbed a flashlight and shakily climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. The door was still locked, but on the doorknob, there was a handprint made of ash, like someone had touched it from the inside. I opened the door. The attic looked the same, but the journal was no longer on the desk. It had been dragged, leaving a streak in the dust, all the way to the shattered mirror from the other night. And this time, in the fractured glass, I didn't see myself. I saw an old man. No, my grandfather, but not as I remembered him. His face was shriveled, withered like a long-dead corpse. His eye sockets were pitch black and hollow. I staggered back screaming, and he smiled, a torn, lipless grin. Then he raised a trembling finger and pointed straight at me. Through the howling wind, I heard a hiss. Page 66. I fled the attic, nearly tumbling down the stairs. I didn't sleep at all that night. My heart pounded erratically, my mind spinning out of control. The next morning, I took the journal to the town library, to the archive room that stored old artifacts and documents. There, I met Miss Gracie, an elderly librarian who had lived in Vermont for over 60 years. When she saw the journal, her hands trembled. This can't still exist," I asked. "You've seen it before?" She looked at me with deep sympathy. "It was brought here once, in 1964. A theology student found it in an abandoned house near Blackmare Lake. Not long after, he disappeared. But before he vanished, he told me something I've never forgotten. Don't read page 66. Page 33 is the beginning. Page 66 is the end. I didn't dare ask why she remembered it so clearly, but I knew I had opened a door that was never meant to be opened. That night I began to dream. I saw myself standing in a forest, a lightless forest. The trees were bare, just dry trunks like hands reaching from the earth. In the center stood a crumbling wooden cabin. I stepped inside. Rows of folding chairs lined the room. On each chair sat a person. Their eyes were sewn shut. Their mouths hung open, as if wanting to speak, but couldn't. I approached a woman. When I touched her shoulder, she jolted up and screamed a word. Behind the mirror, I woke up drenched in sweat. It was still dark. I got out of bed to get a drink of water, but on the bathroom mirror, scrawled in water with a human finger, were the words, 30 days left. I didn't know who wrote it. I live alone. All the doors were locked, but the words vanished the moment I touched them. The next day, I returned to my grandfather's house and decided to examine the journal again. I flipped through each page, counting carefully. When I reached page 66, I realized there were no page numbers at all. But near the center, there was a completely blank page. No writing, no photos, only a small mirror embedded in the middle. I looked into it, and my heart nearly stopped. The reflection wasn't me. It was a version of me, but with empty sockets, not sewn shut, gone. Hollow red, bleeding, but it was smiling. A smile no longer human. Then, it reached out from the mirror. I hurled the journal to the floor and backed away, screaming. The laughter echoed in my head, not through my ears, but inside my skull, like someone was crawling into my brain. I went back to see Alex and told him everything. He wasn't surprised. Page 66 is the second gate. Once you open it, you invite them in. I asked them, "Who are they?" Alex stared at me for a long while. Then he pointed to his head. They have no shape, no voice. They are rejected memories, memories that cannot be seen with the naked eye. And now, they're using your image to exist. I trembled. Is there any way to stop it? Alex stood, walked to his bookshelf, and pulled out an old paper, burnt on one corner. He handed it to me. On it was a drawing, a symbol like an eye sewn shut, surrounded by 3 overlapping circles. This is the seal to lock page 66. But to use it... He looked at me, eyes cold as ice. You must remember. Remember the moment your grandfather spent his life trying to forget. Because he was the one who wrote the journal. I left Alex's house with the sealing paper in hand, feeling heavier than ever. He said that to activate the incantation, I had to remember the moment your grandfather tried to forget. But what moment? I knew very little about his past. He never spoke of his youth. No photos, no letters. No one ever mentioned his life before me. I returned to the cabin, my mind spinning, heart pounding like something was sitting on my chest. Night fell faster than usual, and the darkness seemed denser, clinging to every door, every wall. I placed the journal on the kitchen table, unfolded the sealing paper beside it, then sat down. For the first time in my life, truly afraid of the reflection of my own eyes in the mirror. Then I remembered. There was one place Grandpa never allowed me to enter. His bedroom. I took the old key and walked up to the second floor, where the room had been locked for as long as I could remember. The lock clicked as the key turned. The door creaked open, releasing the scent of old medicine and damp wood. The room was coated in dust, as if time had stopped long ago. I rummaged through the drawers, the nightstand, under the desk, until my hand touched a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. I pulled it out. Inside was a black and white photo, a letter, and something strange. A shard of broken mirror. The photo showed my grandfather as a young man, standing among a group of people, all dressed in black robes, each holding books marked with the same symbol found on the journal's cover. Faint words written on the back read, "The Reflective Right, Hickory Grove, 1965. I shivered. In the letter, with trembling handwriting, Grandpa had written, "If someone finds this box, it means I didn't make it. They made it past the final mirror. I once believed I could hide it forever, bury it deep in forgetfulness. But memories don't die. They wait to be called. And when called, they open their eyes." I brought the mirror shard downstairs and placed it beside the journal. Somehow, it fit perfectly into page 66, as though it had been cut specifically for it. The moment I pressed the shard into place, a small explosion echoed in my head, and the entire room lurched. The lights went out. Thunder roared, and from within the mirror, not the journal page, but the actual mirror shard, I saw the house transform. The kitchen was no longer a kitchen. It had become a dark room with walls covered in portraits, all of me. But in each image, I was slowly deforming, missing eyes, faded skin, no flesh, just a doll-like figure, torn apart and stitched back with red thread. Whispers erupted, overlapping like 100 voices speaking at once. Once you look, you must see. Once you see, you must understand. Once you understand, there is no way back. I threw the journal aside and pulled the shard out of the book. Everything fell silent. But just then, I heard bare footsteps running upstairs. Slap, 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 slap. I climbed up, one step at a time, with only one thought ringing in my mind. Grandpa never lived alone in this house. I opened the second-floor bathroom door. On the mirror, a new message had been scratched, written with a fingernail or some sharp object, carved deep into the glass. More than one person opened page 33. Then, from the hallway behind me, came a voice. "My dear." I turned around. It was Grandpa's voice. I stepped out trembling. No one was there, until I saw the mirror at the end of the hallway, right beside the stairs. In the reflection, Grandpa was standing there, but his face was not human. His eyes were sewn shut, mouth stretched open, as if ready to explode. He raised his hand, just like in the forest dream, and gestured me to come closer. Somehow, I stepped toward the mirror. I reached out, and it wasn't cold. It was warm, like human skin. And then, I was pulled inside. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the house. I stood in the room with the folding chairs, the one from my dreams. They were all empty, except for one, where a child sat. Its head hung low, long hair covering its face. I stepped closer, gently touched its shoulder. It looked up. It had no eyes. Instead, 2 photographs were pasted onto the sockets. One was me, as I am now. One was Grandpa, in his youth. And the child whispered, "Only when the final memory opens will the one who reflects be allowed to sleep." I fell. Around me, the folding chairs reappeared, and seated in them were all versions of me. Versions that had died, gone mad, become blind. I began screaming inside my mind, screaming until my throat felt like it was burning. Who am I? Which one of these is really me? I woke up lying on the living room floor of Grandpa's house. The journal was still there, but page 66 no longer had the mirror, nor was it blank. There was only one line. 27 days left. Story 4. The heartless corpse in the X-ray image. I am an emergency room doctor at St. Jerome's Hospital, located on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My night shift begins at 7 p.m., as always, with the incessant beeping of patient admissions and the smell of antiseptic mingled with sweat. I've grown accustomed to the chaos of night shifts, car accidents, heart attack patients, a few young men stabbed in bar fights. But that night changed the way I looked at the so-called human body forever. At 2:46 a.m., a male patient was wheeled into the emergency room, alert and conscious. No identification. He appeared to be in his 30s, of average build, no external injuries, no signs of trauma. The person who brought him in was an anonymous Uber driver who left the patient at the ER door and drove off as if running from something. We called him John Doe. He didn't say much. He only smiled, gently, as though none of this mattered. But what made me step back was his eyes, grayish, cloudy, like fog, but knowing too much. "How are you feeling?" I asked, bringing a flashlight up to check his pupils. The reflexes were normal. His pulse was steady, blood pressure fine. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice calm, steady, and strangely devoid of any resonance in his chest. No echo. It was as if his chest was hollow. I motioned for Nurse Ruby to take him for an X-ray, as per protocol. We couldn't make any conclusions until we knew what was happening inside his body. About 15 minutes later, Ruby returned pale as a sheet. "Dr. Keller, you need to see this," she said. I looked at the screen, and my heart sank. The X-ray film displayed the chest of John Doe, ribs, lungs, trachea, all clearly visible, except for one thing, the heart. There was no trace of the heart, just a vague empty space, as if it had been surgically removed from reality. I looked at Ruby. Could it be a machine error? "I've checked 3 times, she said, her voice trembling. "I even switched to a different machine. The result is the same." I returned to the patient's room. John Doe was still sitting there, looking out the window. When I entered, he turned to me and smiled. That smile sent chills down my spine. "I just saw your X-ray," I began. "It seems like..." "There's nothing in there, right?" he interrupted. "You know?" "Of course," he said, still smiling. "It's always the same. They all panic until they stop looking at the picture." I didn't know how to react. My instincts told me to call security, but I stayed there, drawn to his oddity like a moth to a flame. "Have you ever had heart surgery?" I asked. "No," he replied flatly. "I've never needed it." I frowned. No one can live without a heart, not even for a few seconds. "So how are you? Have you ever wondered, if a person doesn't need a heart to live, what is he living for?" He tilted his head. Or rather, what is sustaining his life? I felt a chill run down my spine. A deep, cold chill. And when I looked into his eyes again, I saw movement. Very small, as if something else was looking out from inside. We decided to keep him under observation. There was no legal reason to hold a medically stable person, but I justified it with monitoring abnormal symptoms. I had Ruby keep an eye on him through the cameras throughout the night. 3:41 a.m. The surveillance screen flickered and turned black and white abnormally, while all other cameras remained normal. In the video, John Doe was lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, not blinking, And then, for the first time, we saw movement inside his chest. Not a heartbeat, not breathing, but something crawling, a crackling sound under his skin. It looks like something alive in there. Ruby whispered before I could say anything. The screen went black. The entire control room was plunged into darkness for a few seconds before the lights flickered back on. When we rushed into the patient's room, John Doe was still sitting there. But he wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at me with eyes darker than the night itself. "Don't open that picture again," he said. "Next time, it will look back." I didn't know what it was. But that night, Ruby vomited blood and had to be transferred to another hospital. 3 days later, she died from acute multi-organ failure of unknown cause. No trauma, no bacteria, no virus. Just the entire body shutting down all at once. I still keep that X-ray deep in a secret folder, and every time I open it, the dark spot in the image seems to grow a little bigger, closer. I've started having dreams about it. A dark room and a faceless creature standing in the middle. I can't remember its shape, but I know it doesn't belong here. And in the dream, I hear John Doe laughing. Laughing longer. Even longer. Yesterday, I opened the picture again. And this time, it blinked at me. I can't forget that night. The night Ruby died. From the moment she coughed up blood for the first time in the bathroom of the camera control room, a chain of bizarre events began to unfold, as if a monster had been awakened. I still remember Ruby's last look before the ambulance took her away. There was no fear, only resignation, as if she had foreseen her own end and had no strength left to resist. After Ruby's funeral, I was given 3 days off, but I didn't go home. I rented a room 3 blocks from the hospital and began digging into the file of the John Doe patient, or at least whatever I could gather from that night. No medical records, no insurance card, no fingerprints that matched any databases. This man didn't exist on paper. Even the photo of his face, which I obtained from the security camera, was distorted. A strange wave of static covered the image, making his eyes appear blurred, as if they were being erased. A living person, but with no evidence to prove that his existence was real. I brought the X-ray images to an old friend, Dr. Shreya Das, who now teaches at the University of Pittsburgh's medical school. She's a radiology expert and had helped me solve some of the rarest cases before. "No heart?" she asked, furrowing her brow as she looked at the image. "Not just no heart. There's nothing in the center of the chest. An absolute dark spot." Shreya tilted her head. "Like a void." "Exactly. A place without light. And I think it's expanding." She didn't laugh. She didn't laugh like others did when they thought I was joking or overworked. She looked at me seriously and said, "There's a term in ancient Indian folklore. Shunyakaya, the hollow body. The legend speaks of souls without hearts, existing as shells for another entity. They don't need circulation. They don't need blood. They live off memories, fear, and sight." I swallowed hard. "You're saying the void in the X-ray is growing?" I nodded. I compared the image taken at 2:47 a.m. and the one at 3:10. The dark area has spread a few millimeters, as if something is growing inside. That night, I decided to return to the hospital, even though I wasn't on shift anymore. I needed to see John Doe again. I needed an answer before we all started dying one by one, like Ruby, but he was no longer in his room. I frantically asked the nurses on duty, but no one remembered exactly when he left. Some said it was just before dawn. A nurse named Carl even swore he saw him walk through the metal door of the emergency room without making a sound. I retrieved the footage from the surveillance cameras. This time, I used my own equipment to record the screen. I knew if I saved the video to the hospital system, it would be corrupted. 3:16 a.m. John Doe stood up from his bed. 3:17. He walked into the hallway. No one stopped him. 3:18. He stopped in front of camera Suffo, looked straight into the lens. 3:19. The screen went completely black, but exactly 02 seconds before the signal was lost, I saw his eyes turn completely black, like two holes sucking in light. 3:20. The camera returned. The hallway was empty. I rewound and replayed that moment over and over, and it felt like I was staring into a mystery with no way out. John Doe was not just a person without a heart. He had no physical boundaries, no ties to natural laws. He was an entity playing the role of a human. I called Shreya at midnight. Her voice was filled with worry. "I think you're dealing with a form of anti-existence," she said. "An entity that can only exist when others don't understand it. The more you understand, the more real it becomes." I fell silent. "Do you still have the X-ray?" she asked. I still have it on a USB. Throw it away, right now, before it understands you." I didn't listen to her. Instead, I made the dumbest decision of my life. I opened the image again, for the last time. This time, not only had the black area grown, but on its edges, there were shapes, very faint, like the traces of nails scratching the inside of the image. And right in the center, a single eye opened. It was looking at me, not from the photo, but from behind the screen. I recoiled. The computer screen turned off with a snap. Every light in the room flickered and then burst into flames. A burnt smell spread, like human flesh being charred. And then I heard the laughter of John Doe. But this time, it didn't come from my ears. It echoed in my chest, as if it was replacing the place where my heart used to be. I could no longer sleep after that night. Not because of the usual fear, but because I didn't dare to close my eyes. Every time my eyelids would drop, I felt like something was waiting for me on the other side, in the deep, bottomless darkness. And within that blackness, there was a lingering gaze, like a needle stabbing deep into the back of my eyes. Even though I tried to forget that fateful X-ray, I returned to St. Jerome's Hospital, not as a doctor, but as someone searching for traces of a mystery. The deeper I dug, the more I found myself sinking into an abyss. I entered the medical records archive and opened the list of people who had come into contact with John Doe's X-ray images. There were a total of 7 people. Me, Ruby, dead. Carl, the nurse who checked the patient, went missing the next morning. Dr. Melanie Shu, the resident doctor, took an unexpected leave after that night, and no one could contact her. Jeff, the IT staff who maintained the medical imaging system, found dead in his car with his eyes gouged out. Shreya, the friend I had shown the X-ray to, and a medical intern named Miguel. The last one I found. Miguel lived in a student dormitory near the university's medical school. His apartment was small and cluttered with textbooks, takeout boxes, and scraps of paper filled with bizarre symbols. I knocked on his door late at night, and he opened it in such a poor state that I almost didn't recognize him. Dark circles under his eyes, scruffy beard, and holding a rusty fruit knife in his hand. "Did you come to kill me?" Miguel asked, his voice trembling. "I didn't." I hesitated. "Are you okay?" "I'm Dr. Keller. Do you remember me?" He nodded, then pulled me inside as if he feared someone was watching from the hallway. "I can't sleep anymore," Miguel said. "It comes in my dreams. Every time I sleep, it gets closer." "It?" The black shadow in his chest. It's not just emptiness. It's a window leading to somewhere else. I see faces in there. People like Ruby, like Jeff. They don't have forms anymore. They're distorted copies of themselves hiding in that black space. He handed me a scribbled drawing. A human body, hollow in the middle, with dozens of arms reaching out from the empty chest, as if beckoning someone from beyond. I think John Doe isn't the only one. I found a clue in the security camera logs. That night, there was a repeating interference signal at 3 points: the hospital basement, CT scan room 2, and the morgue storage room. I don't know what sent a chill down my spine. The name of the morgue storage room, or the way Miguel emphasized each word, as if every phrase was a piece of a puzzle leading to death. Miguel and I snuck into the hospital at 2:15 a.m. The basement entrance wasn't locked, even though I had requested hospital security to change the lock 2 weeks prior. The air down there was thick, damp, and smelled like old metal mixed with stale urine. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting a weak glow on the grey tiled floor, which was stained with dried blood footprints. Miguel carried his phone, the screen showing a heat map from an infrared camera he had hacked from the old system. "There," he pointed to the left corner. "There's a large, unexplained heat source. It doesn't move." We approached and stopped in front of a heavy steel door marked "Anatomical Sample Storage for Authorized Personnel Only." The door creaked open. Inside was a dark room with rows of body storage cabinets. But what made my breath catch was what lay in the middle of the room. A wax human body, headless, armless and legless, but in the chest was a pitch-black bottomless hole. Miguel whispered, "It's them. This is where they're made." I stepped closer, my hands trembling. Each step felt like being drawn into that emptiness. When I was only a meter away, I heard whispering. Not from outside, from inside my head. "Look, to see, remember, to forget yourself." And then the wax body twitched. I screamed, pulling Miguel back, but he stood still, as if in a trance. His eyes were wide open, pupils dilated to the max. I had to punch him hard in the chest to snap him back to reality. "Go, Miguel, get out now." We ran out of the room, and the steel door slammed shut behind us with a heavy clank, like a curse being triggered. Miguel didn't make it through the night. He had a seizure at 4:03 a.m., his body convulsing, blood pouring from his nose and ears, his eyes bulging out as if they were going to explode. The hospital's conclusion was acute cerebral hemorrhage of unknown cause. I was the last one left. I called Shreya. This time, it wasn't to warn her. It was to say goodbye. The phone didn't pick up. I called again. On the third try, someone answered. But it wasn't Shreya. A whisper came through, soft and faint. "She's already seen it." Then laughter. Long laughter. And I knew I didn't have much time left. I used to believe that science was the ultimate boundary of human understanding. That if a phenomenon couldn't be explained by reason, it must be a mistake, or a figment of imagination. But now, I sit alone in the quiet on-call room of St. Jerome's Hospital, with an image of the forbidden X-ray in front of me, and behind me is something science has no name for. I don't know why I'm still alive. Ruby is dead. Jeff is dead. Miguel is dead. Shreya disappeared. Those who saw the image, those who ventured too close to the void, one by one, they disappeared from this world. I remain, but I feel as though I'm losing small parts of myself. Not in the biological sense, but as if I'm being replaced. That morning, I quietly entered the hospital's data center. My goal was the PACS system, the repository of all medical images, including X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans. I wanted to trace the access history of John Doe's X-ray. I wanted to know who was the first to open it, who was the last. The data center was deep in the technical basement, locked with fingerprint access and security codes. I wasn't authorized to enter, but I had Ruby's old code. She'd helped me fix some storage issues a few months ago. Back then, we even joked about how some of the patient images seemed to breathe. The door opened with a dry beep. Inside was a cold room filled with the hum of cooling fans and the pale light of LED bulbs. Rows of hard drives were stacked like a digital cemetery. I sifted through the records. John Doe's X-ray, file number 244XJ0316. First access, Dr. Keller, 2:51 a.m. Second access, Ruby, nurse, 2:59 a.m. Third access, Jeff, IT staff, 3:03 a.m. Fourth access, Dr. Melanie Shu, 3:09 a.m. Fifth access, Shreya Das, off system, file exported via USB. Sixth access, Miguel Rivas, internal IP access, 3:47 a.m. Last access, data center, 4:12 a.m. Accessed by system root. I stopped. System root? No one should have access at that level except... I clicked on the system administrator list. There was a name I didn't expect. Dr. Thomas Breckner. Thomas was the head cardiologist, someone I had respected and learned from over the years. A calm, polite man, always courteous to patients, never any scandal. But what made my skin crawl was that he had suddenly retired on the very day I encountered John Doe. The reason in the record: loss of reality assessment, signs of paranoia. Requested leave for mental health reasons. I searched for Thomas's medical records. They were locked, but I still remembered his old office was located in the East Wing, the one that had been abandoned after an electrical fire 3 months ago. No one had set foot there since the minor fire. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the cold, deserted hall with its fire-scarred ceiling. Office 213. The door was ajar. Inside was pitch black, the musty smell of a morgue that had been sealed for too long. On the dusty desk lay a black leather notebook. I opened it. The handwriting was messy, trembling. They don't need a heart. They only need an empty chest to live in. A cocoon, a room. What I saw inside him was not a heart. It was the door. They told me, through the picture, through the dreams. Every night, I sleep with the sensation of something, beating softly-ish in my belly, not a heart. They are testing me. I sent him here. I was the first. I opened the door. I flipped to the last page. There was a black ink drawing, a map of St. Jerome's Hospital, but with a red marker drawing an area that had never existed. Sublevel, below the operating room. I had never heard of a sublevel. That night, I followed the map and found the main operating room, only used during the day. I waited until all the staff had left, then used my key card to enter. Under the carpet, against the right wall, was a round metal hatch, like a sewer cover, but with no labels, no technical information. I pried it open with a crowbar. A metal passageway, deep and dark, led downward. A cold wind hit my face, bringing the stench of something rotten, like a corpse long decayed. I took a flashlight and descended the metal stairs. About 17 meters underground, I stepped onto cracked concrete. It was pitch black. Then the flashlight's beam landed on a row of operating tables, old, rusted, and each one holding a body. Headless, limbless, but all with a black hole in the center of their chest. They were identical, copies, no heartbeat, no breathing. I turned to run, but the flashlight caught a figure sitting in the corner of the room. A person, matted hair, a blood-stained old lab coat. It was Thomas Breckner. He looked up, but his eyes were hollow, the pupils black as ink. "You came," he whispered. "I've kept the door open for you. Now you can enter." "Enter where?" I stepped back. "Inside." He pointed to his chest, where there was a black hole, widening. And I heard laughter. Not from him, not from me, but from all the bodies on the operating tables. They were laughing all at once. Story 5. The Silent Watchers Beyond Midnight. I still remember the night we got lost in Huckleberry Forest, part of the Wildmoor campsite, which had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. At first, it was just an impromptu camping trip. It was me, Jake, my best friend from college, along with Cassie, his girlfriend, and the other 2 were Margot, the type of person who was always seeking spooky experiences, and Evan, a quiet guy, but with eyes that seemed to always stare into the void, as though hearing something only he could. When the night began to fall, our phones lost signal and Google Maps couldn't guide us anymore. We realized we had strayed from the main trail. None of us admitted we were panicking, but I could hear Jake breathing heavier than usual, and Cassie kept clutching his hand tightly. As for me, I could feel a coldness that wasn't from the air, the scent of rotten wood, damp moss, and something metallic, like dried blood. It was then that Margot spotted a faint yellow light flickering through the dense trees. An oil lamp, not a flashlight, not electric light, but a faint flickering glow that seemed to be coming from a world that no longer existed. "We should go there. Someone's there," she said, her eyes bright as if she had discovered treasure. Despite my doubts, my feet still followed them. A small shack appeared, no larger than an old RV, its walls made of rough wood and the roof covered with dented tin sheets. A man was sitting inside, his back to us. When we knocked, he didn't look surprised. He slowly turned his head, his face lined with deep wrinkles, eyes clouded like shattered crystal, but his mouth held a gentle smile, so kind that no one would think to doubt him. "The forest isn't peaceful tonight. Come in. Being outside after 2 a.m. isn't wise," he said. No one objected. Despite the shack being full of dust and the smell of mildew, the feeling of 4 walls and a roof was enough to make us feel relieved, as if we were back home. We ate the food we brought and then chose our spots to sleep. The man, he introduced himself as Amos, said, "Whatever happens, don't leave the tent after 2 a.m. Don't open the door. Don't look outside." He emphasized each word slowly, as though reciting a chant. Then he climbed up to a small loft, leaving us with the flickering light of the oil lamp. At 2:16 a.m., the first scratching sound came. At first we thought it was an animal, a bear, a wolf, but no. The sound was something very human, like nails scratching the wood, soft, steady, patient. It's probably the wind, Jake muttered, his eyes wide in the darkness. Not the wind, Margot replied, her voice barely audible. Then the singing began. A female voice, soft, sweet, but out of tune, out of rhythm. And worse, it was my voice. Go to sleep, go to sleep. Tonight the forest is dark. I saw Jake turn to look at me, his face drained of color. Cassie started to gasp for breath. Evan silently crawled toward the door, pressing his ear to it as if hypnotized. I rushed to pull him back. Don't open it, I shouted, my voice choked with fear. She's my mother, Evan whispered. I nearly screamed. Evan had been an orphan since he was 8. We all knew that. And his mother. How could she possibly be here, in the middle of this damn forest, at 2 a.m.? The door shook violently. Something, or someone, was testing its strength. Margot trembled, clutching my hand. From the loft, Amos shouted down, his voice no longer calm. Don't open the door. You mustn't look at it. But Cassie had already moved to the window. She pulled the curtain aside, just a small gap. I've never heard anyone scream like she screamed then. She stepped back, crashing into the wall, urine running down her legs like a child. It's me. It's me standing there. But I have no eyes. We rushed to pull Cassie into the corner, but the singing had turned into a chorus. Not just one voice, but 5. All 5 of us. 5 copies of ourselves. Standing somewhere outside, singing us to sleep. That night felt longer than any night I've ever lived. No one slept. No one dared to close their eyes. When the dawn finally broke, the singing disappeared as if it had never existed. But on the shack's door, 5 blood-stained handprints were still clearly visible. Each handprint with a name carved in with nails. Jake, Cassie, Evan, Margot, and me. Amos didn't say anything as we left. He just stared. That look. Now, when I close my eyes, it still appears in my nightmares. A gaze both regretful and as if he already knew everything. And when we found the way out, saw the asphalt road, flagged down a tow truck, I looked back. There was no shack anymore, just a patch of empty land covered in dry leaves, and a sea of old wood, leaning scrawled with shaky handwriting. Wildmoor campsite closed due to the disappearance of multiple people in 2008. I used to think that as long as we got out of that forest, everything would end. That after seeing the street lights and hearing the sound of the rescue vehicle's siren, we had escaped the nightmare. But I was wrong. Completely wrong. 2 weeks later, I still couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours a night. The singing still echoed in my ears, sometimes at 2:16 a.m., sometimes earlier, sometimes later, as if that moment was a promise that hadn't been kept. I imagined my own shadow, standing outside the bedroom window, singing in my own voice. But the eyes were black holes. Jake started drinking. Cassie stopped speaking. She barely ate, didn't shower, just sat in front of their window, staring out at the garden as though waiting for someone to come back. Evan disappeared. No one knew where he went. The police came, asked us questions, but no one dared to talk about the cabin, the old man Amos, or the singing at midnight. Who would believe us? Margot. She was the only one trying to keep her sanity. She kept calling me, repeatedly asking about the details of the cabin, the lights, the blood-soaked names carved in the walls. And then, one night, she told me something. I think that cabin isn't real. What do you mean? I sat up in bed, my heart pounding like a drum. I looked up the original map of Wildmoor before it was shut down. There's no cabin in that forest. But I found something strange. In 2008, they recorded a checkpoint station, a temporary cabin set up in the final weeks before the mass disappearances. What are you saying? There used to be someone stationed there, making sure no one got out after 2 a.m. I went silent. The image of Amos, his white milky eyes, his smile like he knew the future, came rushing back. And what else? The guard at the station back then was named Amos Creed. He died in that very cabin, burned alive. I felt as if someone had grabbed my heart and squeezed it. I remember the faint smell of burning that day. It was not the smell of rotting wood. Margot hesitated, then whispered, "Maybe he never left that place." The next day, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small notebook, its leather cover cracked and yellowed like it was about to disintegrate. The cover had one scrawled line, "Notes, Amos Creed." I don't remember how badly I was trembling as I flipped through the pages. The first page had only one sentence, "No one escapes without being watched." The second page, "If they sing in your voice, they know your name. If they know your name, you are marked." I couldn't breathe. The following pages were scattered journal entries. Amos recounting how they would return, the knocking on doors, the crying children, the lullaby singing through the night, and how the exit wasn't a path, but a trial, a game. If your name is called after 2 a.m., you no longer belong to this world fully. And the worst part, if you see a copy of yourself, your soul is no longer yours. I immediately called Margot back, but she didn't pick up. I texted, emailed, called Jake and Cassie. No one responded. Finally, I decided to go to Cassie's apartment. Their place was eerily quiet. The door wasn't locked. Inside, everything had been left in a hurry. Half-eaten bowl of noodles, the TV still playing a cooking show, and a blood streak leading from the bedroom to the back door. I almost vomited on the floor. The wall in Cassie's bedroom was scrawled with something like dirt or feces. 216 repeated dozens of times. And the only mirror in the room was shattered. Shards of glass embedded in a photo of Cassie smiling. That night I packed up and rented a motel room on the outskirts. But even the motel wasn't safe. At 2:16 a.m. the knocking started again. Soft, patient, then the singing began. My voice. "Sleep now. Tonight the forest is dark." I stood frozen, like stone. My hands gripping Amos's notebook. There was a ripping sound behind me. A piece of paper fell from the notebook. One I hadn't seen before. A map. No. A diagram. The real exit. And at the end of the map was a line. Only those who have never opened the door can proceed. I had never opened the door, but Evan had. Jake and Cassie had looked outside. Only me and Margot, if she was still alive. The next morning, I left the motel with the map, the notebook, and a camping bag in tow. I was going back to Wildmoor. I needed to know how this ended. I needed to know if there was any path that could free me from this obsession forever. On the road, I turned on the radio. A local channel was reporting. Police have found 3 bodies in the area once known as Wildmoor Campground. Identities have not been confirmed, but the victims show signs of having committed suicide. Each one had a name carved into their hand with a sharp object. I didn't need to hear more. I knew who they were. Jake, Cassie, maybe Evan, or the copies that had taken them. I sped up, my heart pounding like a drum. This time, I wasn't going back to escape. I was going back to face myself. The road back to Wildmoor seemed twice as long as the journey there. Not because it was farther, but because with every mile I passed, something behind me seemed to be getting closer. This feeling was inexplicable. A cold draft, a fleeting shadow in the rearview mirror, and the unsettling sensation as if I were being watched from just a short distance away. I arrived at the old campground gate at dusk. The rusted iron gate hung limply on a broken hinge. The nameplate was corroded, and the words Wildmoor Campgrounds were now just a few scattered letters. As if no one had ever visited here. I stopped the car at the edge of the woods, pulled out the map from Amos's notebook. It wasn't the trail we originally got lost on. This map led to another path, a route overgrown with trees and vines. It wasn't marked on any map I'd ever seen. I stepped into the woods, each footfall feeling like a step backward in time. The air growing thick and damp. The light filtering through the canopy turned gray, like the flicker of lights in a hospital room. The smell of the forest was gone, replaced by the scent of ash, as if everything around me had been burned and then regrown. After nearly an hour of following the map, I arrived at an open space in the woods. There was no hut, just a burned patch of earth with charred wooden posts still standing, like the final spine of a dead creature. I realized this had once been Amos's hut, but it was gone. All that remained was a figure standing silently in the center of the burnt ground. It wasn't Amos. The figure was taller, gaunter, like a stick, wearing an old fabric cap, and it had no face. I couldn't see its eyes, nose, or mouth. Just a pale, smooth patch of skin, like a melting wax mask. I didn't know how long I stood there. The wind howled past my ears, but the figure didn't move. I pulled out the notebook. The last page now had a new sentence that wasn't there before. The gatekeeper never leaves its post, but it never walks on its own. I read it again, a sense of unease filling me. Then I realized he hadn't come for me. I had come to take his place. Footsteps echoed from the right. I spun around. Margot, she looked gaunt, her eyes sunken, her hair a tangled mess. But her gaze was sharp, sharper than I had ever seen. I followed the singing, she whispered. It's never left me since that night. I quickly asked, Do you see them? Margot nodded. I see myself standing outside the living room window. Every night. At first I hid, but then I tried writing my name in red ink and hanging it on the door. After that, it disappeared. I shuddered. Write your name? Yes. They only haunt you once they know your name. But if you give it to them, they're bound by their own rules. Margot moved closer to the burnt ground. This is where Amos died. But he wasn't burned. He burned himself. I turned to look at her, unable to believe it. He knew that if he stayed in position too long, the shadow outside would get inside. He stopped it. And now, it's our turn. Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence. A hoarse call from deep in the woods. Evan! Both Margot and I froze. Do you hear that? I asked. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the edge of the forest. A figure staggered out. Yes, it was Evan. But his body was not normal. His arms were longer than usual, his joints bending in the opposite direction. His eyes were pitch black, and his mouth stretched all the way to his ears, forming a torn, grotesque smile. I found the way out, he hissed. Margot stepped back. That's not Evan, she whispered. That's whatever borrowed his body. Evan, or whatever was wearing his form, stumbled toward the burned ground. Each step he took scorched the grass behind him. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. I pulled out the map. There was a small arrow leading from the burned ground in a different direction, through the forest following a dry creek. The real way out, but not for everyone. We have to leave, I said. No, Margot stopped me. I have to stay. What are you talking about? It takes one to hold the position. If not, the way out will be opened for them to enter. Amos did it. Now it's my turn. I panicked. No, you can't. Margot placed a hand on my shoulder. I saw myself standing by my mother's bed. I know I don't have much time, but you still do. She pulled something from her pocket. A blackened piece of wood with the following inscription. The keeper must not be called by name. If called, they must disappear. Take this. When you hear the call, don't answer and never look back. She pushed me toward the creek. The singing echoed again behind us. Sleep now. The forest is dark tonight. This time, the voices singing were both of ours. I ran without looking back. Behind me, the sound of cracking bones echoed. Then a long, choked scream from Margot. And then silence. I still haven't reached the way out. I'm still following the map, but I'm carrying that piece of wood. And every night, I carve another line. I have not been called, but I have been seen. Story 6. I watched my own face crawl out from the floor, and it smiled. I moved into this apartment at the beginning of September. A small room on the ground floor of an old run-down building on the outskirts of Tacoma, Washington. The rent was so cheap it made me suspicious, but at the time, I had just quit my job in the city and needed somewhere quiet to get my life back together and continue working on a half-finished novel. So I signed the lease, moved in, and began living alone here. Or at least, I thought I was alone. The room was somewhat dim, with a small window facing the backyard. During the day, light story 6, I watched my own face crawl out from the floor filtered through a set of old silver-gray curtains, casting everything in a faded glow, as if the room itself were covered in the dust of time. I used to think it was the perfect space for writing, but after a few weeks, I realized it felt more like a box. A box you couldn't be sure. You were the only one inside. The first time I heard the whisper was on the 12th night. It was around 3 a.m. I woke up without knowing why. Maybe from the cold or a nightmare that left no images behind. As I listened into the darkness, I heard something. Not loud, not clear, but very close. A faint voice rose from beneath the bed. "You're living in my place. Imposter." I jolted upright, heart pounding. My first instinct was to check under the bed, but instead, I turned on the light. The brightness instantly pushed the shadows back, revealing the room exactly as it always was. Nothing under the bed but a box of books and a few bags of old clothes. I told myself it was just a half-waking dream, a trick of a tired mind, but the whisper came back. Every night, exactly at 3 a.m. It wasn't loud or violent, but steady, persistent and real. I started to fear sleep, I dreaded the moment the clock would hit 3 and the whisper would rise from beneath the wooden floor. I told Jenny about it, my best friend from college, still living in Seattle. She thought I was sleepwalking, or worse, hallucinating from isolation and stress. After all, I was living alone, barely going outside, and spending hours holed up writing in a dark room. It made sense until I set up the night camera. I bought a small camera with night vision and placed it at the corner of the room, facing the bed near the window. I didn't expect much. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I was overthinking. But the footage from that night changed everything. At around 3:01 a.m. in the recording, I was lying on my side, the blanket pulled up to my chest. Then, from beneath the bed, something began to move. At first, it was just a shadow. Then slowly, a pale hand reached out, gripping the edge of the mattress. Then came a face. My face. Not similar to mine. Identical. It looked up at the sleeping version of me. Eyes pitch black like bottomless pits. Its lips moved. You're living in my place. Imposter. Then it crawled backward like a spider, its limbs folding in on themselves with a sickening smoothness, vanishing into the darkness under the bed. I nearly dropped my phone watching that footage the next morning. I couldn't stay in the room all day. I got in the car and just drove. No destination. I went to libraries, cafes, shopping centers, anywhere with light and living people. That night I called the police. They came and searched the room thoroughly, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no hidden trapdoors, nothing under the bed except dust and the musty smell of old wood. I showed them the video, but they brushed it off as possible editing or a camera glitch, and told me if I didn't feel safe, I should consider moving elsewhere. I started keeping a journal, documenting every whisper, every strange detail, every small change in my reflection. Because yes, I began to notice changes. A week later, Jenny came to visit. She stayed the night, worried about me. I didn't tell her about the video. I just wanted someone there, so I wouldn't feel completely insane. But the next morning, when she woke up, Jenny looked at me differently. She said that at 3 a.m. I had been standing beside her bed. Just standing, saying nothing, not moving, just staring at her. But I had been asleep on the opposite side of the room. I started doubting myself. What if the thing crawling out from under the bed was me? What if I was the one crawling out each night without knowing it? I came to a horrifying conclusion. One of us isn't real, and I'm no longer sure which one I am. I can't remember the last time I had a full night's sleep. Ever since that first night, I saw it crawl out from under the bed. My face, my voice, but with eyes that were completely alien. Any notion of peace had ceased to exist. Jenny left the next morning, claiming she had an emergency at work, but I knew she was scared. Right before walking out the door, she looked back at me, her eyes wavering between sympathy and suspicion. She left a handwritten note behind, the words trembling on the page. "Are you sure you're still you, Lucas?" I read it 3 times. Each time, the question seemed to echo longer in my mind, like a distorted radio signal that never stops playing. And I hate to admit it, but I wasn't sure either. I tried everything to fight it. I left the nightlight on, wore white noise headphones, even sprinkled salt in a circle around the bed, like the ones I'd read about in paranormal forums. But the thing beneath didn't care about salt, light, or sound. All it needed was time, and 3 a.m. was its hour. On Friday night, I decided to install 2 additional cameras, one by the edge of the bed frame, the other facing the large mirror at the foot of the bed. That mirror, I always avoided looking into it after 3 a.m. because once I'd seen someone walking behind me, and when I turned around, no one was there. I also did something I never thought I'd do. Contacted a specialist in sleep psychology and ego dissociation, Dr. Margaret Hall, someone Jenny had once mentioned during a seminar at school. To my surprise, she agreed to come in person that Monday morning. A small woman, silver hair, eyes sharp like a scalpel. She moved around my room with a magnetic and temperature scanner, meticulously taking notes. Finally, she sat in the wooden chair by the window and said, expressionless, "This room shows signs of ego phase distortion. You're being haunted by yourself. Not a hallucination, a parallel self." I scoffed. "Are you saying I have a twin living under my bed?" She looked at me, deadly serious. "Not a twin, the original. Are you sure you're the one who came out from under the bed? Or the one who replaced whoever used to live here?" I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I'd started seeing memories that weren't mine. Lately, when I lie down, I often dream of another room, same bed, same walls. But the window opens out to a forest, not a lawn. In the dream, I see myself, but not quite me, being dragged under the bed, clawing desperately, a scream choked beneath the wooden floor. That night, I decided to stay awake with the cameras rolling. I sat on the bed, back against the wall, a knife in hand. I wanted to see it, with my real eyes this time. I needed to know which of us was the intruder. 2:59 a.m. The room turned freezing cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that slices through flesh and bone, making my teeth chatter despite the thick sweater I wore. I heard breathing, slow, heavy, rhythmic, but it wasn't mine. It came from beneath the bed, like someone was waiting for their moment to crawl into the light. Then 3 a.m. struck. A hand emerged from beneath the floor. Not skin and bone, but rotting wood, its joints creaking like wind rustling through dead branches. Next came my face. Only it wasn't my face anymore. Its eyes were sewn shut with black thread, its mouth torn open to the ears, tongue dangling like a serpent. It whispered, this time clearly, echoing like metal scraping glass. "You took my body. Now give it back." I backed away, the knife falling from my hand, eyes locked on it. It didn't fully crawl out. Half of it remained stuck beneath the floor, as if it could only exist in the space between sleep and wakefulness, between reality and dream. I screamed, but no sound came. My throat clenched as though gripped tight by invisible hands. And in that moment, one thing became clear. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted to be me. I jumped from the bed and ran for the door. But when my hand touched the doorknob, it was already there, outside. Still me, but wearing a shirt I never owned, with a small scar on the left cheek that I didn't have. It looked at me and spoke, in my voice, "Tonight, I'm the one going out." I screamed and punched it in the face, but my hand went right through it, like hitting smoke. It laughed, then shattered into thousands of mirror-like shards, falling to the floor. I passed out immediately. When I came to, it was morning. Dr. Hall stood beside me, holding a folder. She said, "You need to leave this place." There are spaces you shouldn't stay in too long. They make you forget who's real. I was about to ask what she meant, but then a thought crept into my mind. Cold as ice. What if I'm still under the bed, and the one sitting here, breathing, talking to her, is just the thing that crawled out and never went back? I left that room the very morning after the second night it crawled out. I didn't take anything with me except my wallet, phone, and a small backpack. I left behind all my gear, my clothes, even the half-finished manuscripts on the desk. I didn't want to keep anything that had shared space with it, because now I knew the room wasn't just a place to stay, it was a doorway. And I had been living far too close to the boundary between two realities. I returned to Seattle, staying temporarily at Jenny's apartment. She agreed reluctantly, still clearly haunted by that night she slept over. We didn't talk much about what had happened. At least, not until I asked, "Did you ever look up who lived in that room before I moved in?" Jenny was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her laptop. "I tried back when you first told me, but there wasn't anything clear. But if you're really suspicious about that room, I know a place." The place Jenny mentioned was the Tacoma Housing Records Office, a small tucked-away department inside an old municipal building near downtown. It looked like a place time had forgotten. Yellowed lights, peeling paint, and file cabinets that groaned every time they opened. We arrived late in the afternoon. An elderly receptionist asked why we were there. I told her I was researching the previous tenant of 37B Rose Hill Street, my old room. She frowned, then quietly disappeared into the back. A while later, she returned with an old file folder. The papers inside had yellowed. The spine was covered in thick tape. Scribbled faintly on the front cover in handwriting. R. Miller, 37B, face shifted. Face shifted? What does that mean? I asked. She only shook her head. It's a term we use when someone isn't here anymore, but not exactly gone either. I opened the file. Inside were medical reports, psychiatric evaluations, and a handful of old black and white photographs. One of them made me stop breathing. A man sitting on a bed, clutching his head, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. And he had my exact face. R. Miller. He had lived there from 2009 to 2011. The records noted he suffered from dissociative identity disorder, frequently calling the police to report that someone exactly like me is living my life, and that he crawls out from under the bed every night. In one psychiatrist's handwritten notes, Miller wrote, "I no longer know who I am. The thing under the bed whispers that I've stolen his life. And the worst part is, I don't remember ever having another one before this." I felt nauseous. Flipping a few more pages, I found something that chilled me deeper than anything else. A copy of a death certificate. R. Miller was reported dead, having jumped from the third floor of the Rose Hill building. But the room I rented, 37B, was on the ground floor. I asked the receptionist. She remained silent for a long moment, then replied, "The building used to have 3 floors, but the upper levels burned down in 2012. Now only the ground floor and basement remain. Maybe they just never told you." On the way back, my head was spinning with all the pieces. A fire, a death from jumping, a doppelganger crawling out from beneath the bed, a room once inhabited by someone just like me. I began to feel like I wasn't reliving my own memories, but someone else's. That night, while staying at Jenny's, I locked the bedroom door, with 3 latches, turned on every light, but I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, ears straining for any sound. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on the wall. Not from outside the room, but from inside the closet. I shot upright, trembling. The tapping came again. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. I approached, hand shaking as I turned the closet knob. There was nothing inside, except for a small, neatly folded piece of paper that must have fallen from nowhere, resting quietly among Jenny's jackets. I opened it. Written inside, "I'm not dead. You've replaced me, but you can't hold this position forever." Below that was a pencil sketch. One figure crawling from under the bed. The other lying asleep, bound in metal wire. I left Jenny's apartment the very next morning. I rented a small wooden cabin near the Olympic Forest. No neighbors, no cell signal, no mirrors, no traditional bed. Just a mattress placed directly on the floor. No space for it to crawl out anymore. I wrote everything down in a thick notebook, bound it with chains. I no longer remember how long I've lived this life. I don't know if I'm the original or the copy. But I do know, if I sleep, it will come back. And next time, it might not crawl out from under the bed anymore. Story 7, Delivery Room 4. Do not enter after midnight. My name is Kyle Maddox, a freelance photographer specializing in capturing the final remnants of abandoned places, places that once held life, now echoing only with the muted resonance of the past. Last month, I received an anonymous email. No subject, no signature. Attached was a blurry photograph. A long corridor, moonlight pouring through a shattered window, reflecting off moss-covered tiles stained with old blood. In the lower left corner, a line of red ink, handwritten across the image read, St. Maria Maternity, Naitharim. St. Maria was once the largest maternity hospital in Connecticut, shut down in 1974 after a series of disappearances and reports of mysterious crime. I'd heard the rumors before, but never paid them much attention until I saw that photo, and something in it felt like a call, meant for me. I drove into the town of Barrow Ridge at dusk. The hospital was about 10 miles from the center, buried deep within a dense pine forest, cold and forgotten. The front gate was sealed with thick chains, but the rusted fence beside it was easy to climb. I brought my camera, a headlamp, and an EMF recorder, standard gear for my explorations into the allegedly haunted. Inside, the air was so cold, it fogged the lens within steps. The ceiling was peeling, floor tiles cracked and uneven, and a musty, almost sour stench lingered between dark, rusty bloodstains. I switched on my light, sweeping it slowly around. The narrow corridors twisted like a maze, and everything, including the silence, felt frozen in a time that no longer existed. I kept shooting, corner after corner, detail after detail. But when I reached the east wing, I felt something wrong. The air grew heavy, like molten metal pressing against my chest. And I swear I heard a faint, rolling sound echoing from afar, like the wheels of an old baby carriage gliding across aged tiles. Steady, deliberate, and spine-chilling. I turned the light toward the sound. A white figure was approaching from the far end. I froze. A woman in a 1960s nurse's uniform, white cap with red trim knee-length skirt, thin gloves, was slowly pushing a metal stroller, the wheels screeching with rusty groans. I swallowed hard. "Excuse me," I called out. "I'm just here to take photos." If you need help, she didn't respond, just kept walking. And when she passed under the flickering hallway light, the stroller was completely empty. My heart slammed in my chest. Instinctively, I raised the camera and snapped a photo. She glided past me, head slightly bowed, eyes hollow, like she didn't see me at all. But then I looked at the floor. The stroller's shadow didn't match the real one. In the shadow, there was an infant curled tightly, mouth gaping as if in mid-scream. I stood paralyzed. No sound, no breath. Just the shadow, a thing that didn't belong to this reality. I turned to look back. She and the stroller had vanished around a bend. Without thinking, I ran after her. The light on my head swayed wildly, throwing shadows across sealed doors and moldy walls. Left, then right, then I slammed into a rotted wooden door, slightly ajar. Inside was a row of metal gurneys draped in white sheets, all covered in thick dust, except one at the end. Its sheet was shredded, soaked in dried black blood. Beside it hung a crooked sign, barely legible. Delivery room 4, do not enter after midnight. Just then my phone vibrated violently. A text from an unknown number. Check the photo you just took. My hands trembling, I opened the gallery. The photo I'd taken as the nurse passed by. Something was completely off. In the image, she was staring directly into the lens. Her mouth curled in a tight, unnerving smile, as if she knew I was taking the shot. But I remember clearly. She never lifted her head. I stepped back, but my foot hit something soft. I looked down. A torn, filthy doll. Its head split open, stuffed with strands of human hair. The rolling noise returned, faster this time. I turned. No one was there. But the hallway had changed. The doors on both sides were now tightly shut. From behind them came a rising cacophony. Hissing, moaning, knocking, crying, all layered into a hellish choir of trapped souls. I bolted from the delivery room, sprinting down the dark corridor. The sounds chased me. Newborn screams, screeching wheels on tile, and a woman's whisper right at my neck. Give her back to me. I burst through the emergency exit and stumbled into the back courtyard. I swear, I heard the stroller wheel stop right behind the slamming door. I didn't look back. I never will. That night at home, I reviewed the photos. The final image, one I didn't recall taking, was from the same hallway I had just fled. But I wasn't in it. Just the nurse standing still, staring into an empty space where I should have been. And the stroller? It was no longer empty. Inside was a baby, eyes wide open, mouth tightly shut as if holding back a scream. But in the mirror behind her, the nurse had no face. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the baby in the stroller reappeared. Wide, unblinking eyes, skin pale as candle wax, and lips tinged blue, tightly sealed, as if holding a secret I was never meant to know. But what was worse was the crying. It didn't come from the photo. It came from behind the mirror, hanging in my room. At first, I thought I was just exhausted, stressed, but at exactly 2:16 a.m. The timestamp marked night 13 on the photo. The crying started again, soft, wet, as though a newborn had been abandoned on the cold tile floor. I turned on the light. No one was there. But the flashlight I'd left beside my bed wasn't in its place. It was lying in front of the mirror, and next to it, clearly visible on the dusty floor, were tiny stroller wheel tracks. I returned to St. Maria Hospital the next afternoon. Part of it was curiosity, the rest, perhaps madness. was because I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched even inside my own apartment. If that ghost wanted to show me something, then I would see it through to the end. This time, I brought a low-frequency audio recorder and a pocket notebook to document every detail. I also decided to find my way to the records room, hoping to learn more about the mysterious nurse or the missing infants. The archive was on the ground floor behind the main corridor near the old diagnostics wing. The door was locked, but easy enough to pry open with a crowbar. Inside was a world long forgotten. Torn papers, scattered patient files, and dust thick as ash from a fire that had burned through memory. I turned on my flashlight and searched for files labeled 1972-1974. My hands trembled when I found a thick folder marked Nurse Resignation Forms. The first page was a list of staff who had left. One name was crossed out in red 5 times. Clara Wills. No reason for departure. No signature. Just a handwritten note in the margin. Do not let her return. Ever. I kept searching and found a medical file labeled Class 3. Internal Confidential. I didn't know what Class 3 meant, but when I opened it, the air around me felt noticeably colder. Inside were records of stillbirths, premature deaths, and one disturbing section. Mother requested the body not be kept. Each file ended the same way. Final recipient, Clara Wills, night shift nurse. I was writing this down when a cold breeze brushed the back of my neck, and then a whisper right beside my ear. They were never born, but I still cared for them. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across empty space. But the file in my hands had been flipped to another page, a blank one, except for a tiny blood-stained fingerprint. I dropped the file and turned to leave, but the door had somehow shut. I rushed over and yanked the handle. It was frozen solid, as though it had never been opened. The soft squeak of stroller wheels echoed behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but it was coming closer, step by step, until it stopped right behind me. I could feel the frost-like breath settle on my neck. Then came the chorus of infant voices, dozens of them, whispering together like a twisted lullaby. Stay with us. Don't leave us like Mommy did. I screamed and slammed on the door until the hinges snapped. I bolted out, heart pounding. My headlamp flickered, and as I passed a hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse. Clara Wills, in her white uniform, pushing the same stroller, smiling like she was welcoming me. That evening, I tracked down an elderly woman named Ellen Park, who used to work as a nurse assistant at St. Maria in 1972. She agreed to meet me at an old cafe near the town's main church. When I mentioned the name Clara Wills, Ellen turned pale. Clara wasn't like the others, she said. She loved the babies, but in the wrong way. I once saw her rocking a dead infant all night, whispering lullabies in Latin that no one had taught her. The children under her care, most of them didn't survive, but no one dared accuse her. They just moved her to the night shift until... She stopped pouring more coffee with trembling hands. Until what, Ellen? I asked. She looked at me, eyes glassy with tears. One night, she vanished, along with 3 newborns that had never been entered into the hospital system. Police searched the basement. They found nothing, except a trail of blood from delivery room 4 leading down to the surgical sublevel. After that, the hospital was shut down, but what? Ellen pulled an old black and white photo from her coat pocket. It showed a group of nurses. In the middle row stood a woman in a white uniform, Clara Wills. "This photo was taken in 1971," Ellen whispered. "But Clara died in 1969 from hemorrhage during childbirth." My stomach sank. "So, that means," I murmured. Ellen nodded, tears now streaming freely. "Since then, people have seen her wandering the halls, pushing the stroller, looking for babies, or someone to replace them. When I got home, there was an old rusted iron stroller waiting at my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for remembering us." "Clara, there was no baby in the stroller, but when I lifted it, a child's voice whispered behind me, 'I want to be born, to be named.' I hadn't slept for 3 nights since the last time I saw the iron stroller outside my house. Even after I had dragged it to the dump, it reappeared the next morning, clean, in the exact same spot, as if no one had ever touched it. Every night, exactly at 2:16 a.m., a weak infant's cry echoed through my apartment. Faint at first, then closer, until I could hear a soft scratching at my bedroom door, like tiny fingers trying to push it open. I knew then I couldn't run forever. If this was what Clara Wills had left behind, then perhaps there was only one way to end it all. Return to St. Maria, go down to the basement, and open the door that had remained untouched for 50 years. I went back to the hospital on a Sunday morning. Not at dusk like before. This time I needed daylight. I brought a high-powered flashlight, an iron rod, a coil of rope, and a camera with infrared capabilities. The basement area of St. Maria lay beyond a side corridor at the end of the diagnostics wing. I had walked past it before, but back then, the door had been sealed shut with 3 chains and a rotting wooden plank, etched with the words, "Delivery room sealed, permanently closed." I cut through each chain with pliers, the snap of metal echoing down the empty hallway, like it had awoken something sleeping. When the last wooden plank came off, the door creaked open, and a pungent smell of dried blood mixed with antiseptic rushed out. The stairs down were narrow and dark, each step coated in a layer of green moss, damp and freezing. I turned on my flashlight and started descending. The deeper I went, the dimmer the natural light became, and the heavier the air felt, compressed, unnatural. Then again, the sound of wheels rolling, coming from behind me. I turned, no one there. But when I lowered the beam to my feet, small wheel tracks were clearly imprinted in the dust, right behind my heels. The basement was a maze of windowless rooms. Scrawled in white chalk on the walls were trembling, childlike messages. "She took the baby. Don't let her sing it to sleep. I can't breathe." I passed one room with a thick oak door, sealed with 3 uneven layers of hardened cement. Carved into the surface were words in Old Latin. "Non aperias nisi animam habes dare." Translation: "Do not open unless you are willing to give your soul." I knew I shouldn't proceed, but I chipped away the cement. I pushed the door open. Inside, it was pitch black. My flashlight barely illuminated a meter ahead. Still, I stepped in. With each footfall, the air grew denser, stickier, colder. Then, the flashlight went out. I stood there, swallowed by total darkness. And then, the children's voices began. Not crying, laughing, giggles all around me, like they were playing hide and seek. One voice whispered right next to my ear, "Don't be scared. She'll sing you to sleep." A sudden flicker of light from somewhere I couldn't trace. And I saw her, Clara Wills, standing in the middle of the room, cradling a bundled infant in her arms. The baby wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. Its eyes were shut, skin waxy pale. But Clara rocked it gently, whispering, "Sleep, my darling, sleep so still." When she looked up at me, she had no eyes, only two black, hollow sockets. Her mouth opened, and a voice deeper than her own, from within her throat, spoke. "You've come. They need someone to stay behind." I stepped back, but the floor beneath me turned to sludge. I looked down, tiny childlike arms reaching up from the floor, clutching my legs, pulling me downward. They had no faces, only smooth round heads with wide, toothless mouths trying to swallow me whole. I thrashed, swung my flashlight, screamed, "I'm not their father. I have nothing to do with you." An elderly voice echoed from every direction. "You don't need to be their father. Only someone with a heart that can love." From my pocket, I pulled out the old photo of Clara that Ellen had given me, held it up like a charm. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. Clara ceased her lullaby. The baby in her arms slowly opened its eyes, and they were my eyes. Identical, exactly the same, as if it was a part of me that had been torn away. I threw the photo into a small flame, flickering in the corner of the room. A violent wind erupted, crying, lullabies, laughter, all blended into a collapsing nightmare. The room began to fall apart. I bolted, scrambled up the stairs in a frenzy, hearing every step of Clara behind me, pushing the stroller, following me relentlessly. When I reached the door to the ground floor, a freezing hand seized my wrist. "If you leave, there will be no one left with them." I don't know where the strength came from, but I broke free, stumbled out, and collapsed onto the damp ground outside. When I looked up, the basement door had sealed itself shut again. Concrete layers perfectly smooth, as if they'd never been broken. But lying beside me was the iron stroller. I left Barrow Ridge the next morning, never went back, took no more photographs. But the story isn't over, because last night, at 2:16 a.m., I heard the wheels rolling across my wooden floor. And when I stepped out, the stroller was there, sitting silently in the middle of the room. This time, there was an actual baby inside. Its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. Its mouth closed tight. No crying. A small white note was taped to its cheek. "You'll stay this time, won't you, Daddy?" Story 8. The thing upstairs was human. Once I never believed in haunted houses, until we moved into that one, on a quiet autumn afternoon, in a desolate suburb in northern Oregon, where the sun sets too quickly and the wind carries the scent of rotting trees. There were 4 of us. Me, my husband Mark, and our 2 children, Lily, 9 years old, and Connor, just 6. We had left Portland after Mark lost his job, and this small, oddly cheap single-story house appeared like a miracle during one of the most uncertain periods of our lives. The house stood at the end of Birch Hollow, a narrow dirt road with no street lights, surrounded by dense forest, its frame mostly hidden behind a decaying wooden fence. The previous owner had sold it in a hurry for personal reasons, according to the realtor. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, until the 3rd night. It was 2:17 a.m. I woke up to the sound of a chair scraping across the ceiling above us. It wasn't loud, but in a single-story house with no second floor, the sound struck like an icy slap in the middle of the quiet night. I shook Mark awake, but he brushed it off. Probably the wind. Old wooden roof, you know. It creaks all the time. I said nothing, but I didn't sleep again that night. 2 days later, I called an electrician to check the attic, or rather, to confirm that there wasn't one. The house had no attic space, no crawl area above our heads. The electrician, an elderly man named Carl, even stuck his head between the beams in the ceiling and scanned everything with a flashlight. Nothing but dust and cobwebs, he muttered, wiping his forehead. No rats, no squatters. You're all good here. I wanted to believe him, but that night the footsteps returned, and this time they weren't soft. They pounded, like someone was running above our heads. Mark leapt up this time. He grabbed his baseball bat and stormed out the back door, flashlight pointed at the roof. Nothing. No one. The next day, Lily came to me and whispered something that froze my blood. Mom, I saw a head peeking down from the ceiling when I was brushing my teeth. A head? What kind of head? A weird one. It had no hair, and it was just staring at me. But when I screamed, it disappeared. I looked at her closely. Her face was pale. She had dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. I started noticing Connor was unusually quiet too. No more laughing, no more playful mischief. Every time a sound came from the ceiling, the kids would glance at each other and huddle together, like it had become a habit. I began hearing whispers at dawn, muffled voices, like someone trying to speak through a hand pressed over their mouth, coming from above the bathroom ceiling. One morning, I stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes, ear pressed against the ceiling, and I'm sure I heard, "Don't open it. Don't open it." We decided to inspect the old fuse box in the laundry room out back, something I'd never even touched since moving in. It was an old rusted metal box, smelling of mold and ash. When I opened the lid, my whole body locked up. Inside, it wasn't just wires and switches like I expected, but a small hollow space, just big enough to fit a notebook. There was no notebook, but on the wooden panel at the back, scrawled in thick, shaky black charcoal letters, were the words, "I'm still living above you, still." I nearly vomited on the spot. Mark saw it too. His face turned ghostly pale. He slammed the box shut, locked the laundry room, and whispered, "We're leaving tomorrow morning." But we never made it to the morning. That night at 2:16 a.m., I woke to a furious inhuman screaming from the ceiling. Not footsteps, not scraping furniture, but the pounding and shrieking of a man, his voice ragged and violent. "Get out of my house! Get out!" Connor screamed in terror. Mark ran to the laundry room door, but it was locked from the inside. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, the room was empty, except for one new thing, a scorched Polaroid photo lying beneath the fuse box. It showed a family, but every face had been violently scratched out, beyond recognition. We couldn't sell the house. No one would buy it. Every night, the footsteps, the screams continued. The police came, searched, inspected. No one found any trace of someone living above us. But I knew there's something up there. A man. Or something that used to be one. It doesn't want us here, but it will never let us leave. I started recording everything in an old notebook I found in the shed behind the garden one foggy morning. Not to keep memories, but because I felt like if I didn't write it all down, I'd lose my mind. Something was breaking the rules of logic, and if I didn't cling to reality with words, I feared I'd vanish. Just like those eerie sounds that grew louder with each passing night. After the night when the screaming came from the ceiling, Connor began talking to himself. At first, I thought he was just scared, trying to comfort himself. But when I asked, he gave only one reply. "I'm not alone, Mommy. He talks to me." I asked, "Who is he?" Connor pointed to the ceiling. "He lives up there, but he's not mean. He just doesn't like strangers in his house." A chill ran down my spine. Lily started avoiding rooms with low ceilings. She would look upward with wary eyes, as if afraid something might fall on her at any moment. We decided to leave the house with only a few bags of clothes and essentials. But strangely, the car wouldn't start. The battery was brand new and the tank was full. We called a mechanic, and that night, a man named Ramon crashed straight into the streetlight outside while trying to pull into the driveway. "I saw someone run in front of the car," he said, pale as a sheet. "Naked, pale as chalk. I swear, he looked right at me and smiled. His eyes were coal black, no whites at all." After that, no one dared come near our house again. Mark grew silent. He stayed up through the nights, trying to keep watch, but mostly just sat motionless by the kitchen door, clutching a baseball bat like a man lost in his own home. One night, as I lay on the living room couch, I heard sobbing. Not from the kids, from the ceiling right above my head. The sound, it was like an adult trying to hold back tears, mixed with soft grinding noises, like someone clenching their teeth through pain. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the realtor who sold us the house, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Holloway, and demanded to meet her in person. After some hesitation, she agreed, but not at her office. She insisted on a cafe nearly 20 miles from our house. When we met, she looked far older than I remembered. Her face was pale, her fingernails bitten to the quick, like someone who hadn't had a full night's rest in years. I asked, "Has anyone ever died in that house?" She was silent for a long time, then sighed. "Not died, but disappeared. The previous tenant was Walter Griggs, an odd old man who lived alone for nearly 30 years. No one ever really saw him leave the house. Until one day, police went in after mail piled up at the door. But they found nothing. No body, no personal items, no signs of moving out. Just an empty house and what?" I asked, voice trembling. A sentence written on the bathroom wall in charcoal. I didn't go anywhere. People just stopped seeing me. That night, I did something foolish. I decided to check the attic. I knew it was dangerous, but I needed answers. I needed to confirm this wasn't just the fear-induced hallucination of a stressed-out mother. I pulled down the ladder, opened the small attic hatch above the hallway, strapped on my headlamp, and slowly climbed up. Inside was nothing but dust and rotting wood. But when I shone the light to the left, I saw something covered in a tarp. Trembling, heart pounding in my ears, I approached. I gently pulled back the cloth and found a small wooden chair placed right between two ceiling beams. And on it, a dark brown music box scorched along one edge. I touched the music box, and it sprang open on its own. It played Brahms' lullaby, but walked like it was echoing from another world. Inside the box, I found an old piece of paper. On it, written in faint handwriting, "You don't hear me, but I hear all of you." That moment, I heard a scraping sound behind me. I whipped around. No one was there. But on the thin layer of dust across the beams were footprints, adult-sized, clear, and very fresh. I climbed down, closed the attic hatch, and quietly moved the chair away. Then I locked all the doors and windows and turned off every light in the house. That night, I dreamed of a gaunt man with black eyes and no eyebrows staring down at me from the ceiling. He whispered, "You entered my domain. You brought the noisy ones. Now suffer." When I woke up, there was a black handprint across my stomach, like someone had pressed an ash-covered palm against my bare skin. The next morning, Lily was gone. The door hadn't opened. No signs of forced entry. No sound in the night. But Lily was missing, and on her pillow, there was a small note written in charcoal. "She's staying. You, stay silent." I remember clearly the moment I burst into Lily's room and found the bed empty. The room was unnaturally cold, as if all the warmth had been sucked out in a matter of seconds. The curtains swayed even though there was no wind. Her blanket, the one she always wrapped herself in when she slept, was pulled off to the side, and on the pillow was a crudely scribbled note in black charcoal. "It stays. You, stay quiet." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Maybe I had passed the threshold of fear. At that moment, every sense in me went numb, except for one thought that drilled into my brain like a spike. She didn't disappear on her own. She was pulled away, and it is still here. Mark called the police. This time they came immediately. 2 officers, one young, named Dawson, and an older lieutenant named Marianne, searched every room, every corner. But like always, there was nothing suspicious. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of unusual movement, except one thing. The chair in my room had been dragged slightly out of place, as if someone had stood on it to reach the ceiling. I pointed at it and said, "Lily couldn't have climbed up there. She's just a child. She's afraid of heights." Lieutenant Marianne gave me a pitying look. "Do you think maybe Lily left the house on her own and someone took her outside?" I shook my head. There was no door opening, no footprints. Connor slept next to me all night. No one heard a sound. I looked at Officer Dawson, the only one who had stayed completely silent throughout the inspection, and saw that he was staring at the ceiling, right where I had heard the crying before. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. After a few seconds, he whispered, "There's a new crack up there, like something pushed out from the other side." That afternoon, after the police left, I locked every door, drew the curtains, and pulled out the old ladder again. I climbed up to the ceiling one more time, but this time I brought a floodlight, a knife, and a small camera. The air above the ceiling was strangely damp, thick with the scent of smoke and charred wood, like death rotting beneath ashes. As I swept the light across the space, I froze when I saw one floorboard slightly out of place. My heart pounded as I gently pushed it aside, and underneath was a narrow cavity, just wide enough for a person to crawl down through the ceiling. But it wasn't the attic. It was a tunnel, crude, carved between insulation and wooden beams, snaking along the framework of the house. Someone or something had lived there, was living there. I didn't go in. I didn't dare. Instead, I took photos and backed away, heart hammering in my throat. Before I climbed down, my light caught something in the far right corner, a tattered fabric doll. I recognized it immediately. Lily called her Gracie, I whispered. I grabbed the doll, stuffed it into my jacket pocket, and sealed the ceiling shut. My hands trembled uncontrollably. Mark didn't believe me. He looked at the doll and said, Maybe she hid it up there before. I screamed, "Mark, that ceiling is over 3 meters high. I've climbed it. I've checked every inch. There was nothing. But now, there is." He went silent, panic flickering behind his false calm. Finally, he admitted, "I heard it. Last night. Footsteps on the ceiling. But I thought I was dreaming." That night, I set up a camera in the living room, pointed straight at the ceiling. I let it record all night, locked my bedroom door, had Connor sleep beside me, and Mark stayed in the living room to keep watch. At 3:12 a.m., I shot upright. Mark was screaming. I ran out. The living room was empty, windows still shut, but the pillows, blankets, even the baseball bat, gone. Connor clung to me, shaking. I rewound the camera. The footage was blurry and grainy, but it caught something. At 3:08 a.m., an arm reached down from the ceiling, pried open the crack I had found the day before. Then a face appeared, blank, black eyes like endless pits, and a grotesque smile, silently scanning the room. As the camera tilted away, right before it powered off, it caught one last thing, part of Mark's body being pulled upward. I called the police again. They came, but this time they didn't go in. They stood outside, exchanged brief words, and finally handed me a business card. Abigail Carr, paranormal investigation specialist Lieutenant Marianne, leaned in and whispered, "We're not allowed to talk about it, but she once investigated a case just like this. Same kind of house. Someone living above the ceiling, even though there was no attic." My hand trembled as I held the card. That night, I called Abigail Carr. Her voice was low, firm. "You're not crazy. Something is living above your ceiling, but it's not human." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" "A resident spirit, but not an ordinary ghost. It's been marked, trapped after an incomplete ritual. And now, it feeds off the presence of others." "What do you mean?" "The more people underneath it, the stronger it gets. It feeds on fear, sounds, emotion. The more you react, the deeper it anchors." "Then what do I do? How do I save my daughter and my husband?" A pause. "We have to enter its primary nesting ground, not the ceiling itself, but above the ceiling. And to do that, you must find the access point. A door that only appears at one exact time, 2:16 a.m. Tonight, I will wait for 2:16 a.m. I will find that door. I will step into the place where Lily was taken, and if I get the chance, I will bring Mark back too." I stayed awake all night, sitting alone in the pitch-dark living room, lit only by a flashlight and a voice recorder set in front of me. My last thread of fragile control. The wall clock ticked slowly, each sound like a warning. I glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly, and stepped slowly toward the hallway that led to the laundry room. The place with the old fuse box, where I once saw that shaky charcoal message. 2:14. I stopped at the wooden door, my palms drenched in sweat. The air around me was changing, heavier, damper, as if I was slowly stepping into the gut of a living creature. I turned the doorknob. It was ice cold. 2:15. The door creaked open with a sound that sliced through the silence. The laundry room was pitch black. No moonlight, no wind. Everything stood still, like a frozen frame from a photograph. I swept the flashlight across the room. Nothing had changed. I began to whisper, "Lily, Mark, is anyone there?" 2:16. A cracking sound echoed from above. I looked up. The ceiling opened, not like something collapsing or breaking. It split silently, like a hidden door gliding apart. Wooden planks shifted aside to reveal a black void, Cold air spilled down, thick with the stench of burnt charcoal and raw meat. I instinctively stepped back, but the flashlight flickered onto something strange. In the center of the laundry room floor, a circle of dark charcoal had appeared, with odd markings inside, symbols drawn in haste, maybe with fingernails or dried blood. I didn't think. I just remembered Abigail's words. If you want to find them, you have to go to the dwelling itself. The door only appears at 216. I stepped straight into the circle. There was no light, no falling sensation, no force pulling me in. Just a blink, and I realized I was somewhere else. The room I landed in wasn't an attic, no wood, no insulation. Instead, it was a space like an upside-down crawl space. Everything was inverted. Chairs clung to the ceiling. A rotting dining table stuck to the wall, and suspended midair, Mark, floating. His eyes wide open, his mouth frozen mid-scream, as if calling out to me. But no sound escaped. "Mark," I screamed, but my voice vanished like it had been swallowed. What answered me was a guttural laugh from the distance. I turned. A hallway, also inverted, stretched out beyond the walk room. Along its sides were aged wooden doors, each marked in chalk, 13, 27, 41, 52. I walked to door 13 and opened it. The stench of death hit me in the face. Inside the pitch-black room was a crib. In it lay the decaying corpse of a child, clutching a doll that looked exactly like Gracie. I stumbled back and slammed the door shut, my heart racing. This isn't just a residence. It's a prison. I moved on. Door 27 opened to a room with nothing but a shattered mirror. Inside it, I saw my reflection, but distorted. In the mirror, I had no eyes. My hands were covered in ash. I was whispering something I couldn't hear. Then, my mirrored self raised a hand and waved at me, with a forced grin that stretched to its ears. I slammed the door and shuddered. Door 41 wasn't locked. I pushed it open slowly. Inside, I saw Lily, curled up in the middle of the room, holding her doll. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom, Mommy." I ran to her, but as soon as I touched her, the room began to twist. The ceiling melted like wax. The floor pulsed like living flesh. And from behind me, it appeared. Walter Griggs. No, not him anymore. It was using his form. His face had elongated unnaturally, skin brittle like burnt paper, and from his eyes, ash fell in slow, steady drips. "You took back what was mine. I'll take 2 lives in return." I clutched Lily, turned, and ran. The hallway walked, doors flung open. Hundreds of gray hands reached out, trying to drag us back. His voice echoed everywhere. "I am above. You will always be below." I raced toward the first room, where Mark still floated. I screamed, "Mark, take my hand!" He reached out. I grabbed it, and everything collapsed. I woke up on the laundry room floor, retching black water. The ceiling had closed. The charcoal circle was gone. Connor was sitting by the door, trembling, next to me, Lily. She was still unconscious but breathing steadily. And in the corner, Mark, mumbling, his eyes cloudy, as if lost. But he was alive. The next morning, I called Abigail. She only asked one question. "Did it follow you back?" Before I could answer, the call dropped, and on the screen appeared a line of black letters, etched from the inside of the glass. "I'm still above you." Story 9. I got a call from a dead person's phone. My name is Rachel. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and if you're reading this, I have only one thing to say. Never answer a phone call after midnight from someone who's already dead. The city is always alive, even at 2 in the morning. But in my tiny 7th floor apartment, every sound is muffled behind thick glass. I've lived alone ever since the accident. Ever since Daniel, the man I loved more than myself, died in a brutal crash exactly 49 days ago. I can't forget that night. Just like I can't forget his voice, his smile, or the warmth I felt every time I held him close. I was lying still in the dark, eyes wide open. Like every other night, rain was falling. Not heavy, just a soft drizzle. But the drops tapping against the window sounded like someone gently knocking, trying to be let in. And then, the phone rang. The shrill sound tore through the silence like a blade. I glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m., the death hour, the time when, according to folklore, wandering souls try to return. I grabbed my phone. The screen lit up with the name, Daniel. I froze. No way. I had deleted his number. I had watched the coffin lower into the ground. I had heard the earth thudding onto the lid. He couldn't be calling. He couldn't. And yet, I answered, Rachel. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. His voice. It was Daniel's, trembling, fragmented, like a whisper carried from a faraway place without light, as cold as a windowless basement. It's me, Daniel. Don't hang up. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw the phone out the window, but another part wanted to listen, to believe there was a rational explanation, that it was some sick joke from a stranger, or maybe I was dreaming. I'm stuck. Rachel, you have to help me. I don't know where I am, but it's so dark, so cold. I couldn't say a word. Just listened to his ragged breathing and what sounded like scratching against metal on the other end of the line. There's a mirror in front of me. It's cracked. You have to find it and break it. I think if it shatters, I can get out. Mirror? I whispered the only word I could form. At 409 Hollow Street, basement. Don't let anyone see you. Don't ask anyone. Go now, before 3 a.m. Click. The call ended. I sat frozen. The phone slipped from my hand. 409 Hollow Street, I'd never heard of it. But something inside me stirred. Hope? Love? Or something darker, lurking in the desperate yearning to see him again. I left the apartment in a thin raincoat, worn sneakers on my feet. Boston streets were slick and cold, streetlights blurred by the soft rain. The taxi dropped me off in a forgotten neighborhood where every storefront was shut and every silhouette looked like a ghost. 409 Hollow was wedged between two abandoned buildings. No sign, no front light, just a cracked wooden door sealed by a rusted padlock. Strangely, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, heart thudding. Inside was pitch black. Only the slow dripping from the damp ceiling and the musty smell of rotting walls filled the space. I followed the dim glow of my phone flashlight and found a wooden staircase leading to the basement. Each step creaked under my weight. Groaning like the house itself was resisting, the basement was freezing. The walls were painted black, flaking with age and decay. At the far end stood a massive mirror reaching from floor to ceiling. The glass was cracked like a spider web, reflecting my image, but not in sync. I moved my right hand. My reflection moved the left. I turned my head, but the image stared straight ahead. I stepped back. This can't be real. Then I heard footsteps, not mine. Someone was stepping out from the mirror. It was Daniel, but not the Daniel I remembered. He was gaunt, with sunken eyes, skin pale like wax, and lips so dry they were cracked and bleeding. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'm free." I backed away, hitting the wall behind me. My heart stopped as he raised a hand and placed it on the mirror. The glass shattered. A small explosion echoed in my mind. Shards fell, scattering across the floor like a glittering wound. In the middle of the broken glass, words were written in blood, droplets, dripping from Daniel's hand. "Your turn now." And my phone flashlight died. I don't remember how I got out. All I remember is waking up in my apartment. But the mirror in my bathroom no longer reflects me. And every night, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the phone rings again. The number calling is mine. I don't pick up. I can't. But I know. One day, I will. I thought I had just woken from a nightmare. But the shards of broken glass were still on the bathroom floor. The blood-red writing, "Your turn now," was still etched like a scar into the white porcelain. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. It wasn't just a dream. The strange part was, no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The doorman still smiled, like always. The old woman downstairs still blasted jazz on her radio every morning. No one heard the mirror shatter. No one saw me running through the rain at dawn. And me, I no longer had a reflection in any mirror. I tried everything, taking selfies in front of a mirror. Only the background showed. Checking my reflection in elevators, public restrooms, even bus windows. Absolutely nothing. I no longer existed in the world of reflections. It felt like some part of my soul was still trapped somewhere. Maybe on the other side of that broken mirror. But that wasn't the worst part. Not until the third night. 2:13 a.m. The phone rang again. Still my number, calling me. I didn't answer. I thought if I ignored it, it would stop. But the calls kept coming. Every night, exactly at 2:30. I turned off my phone, changed SIM cards, even bought a new one. Nothing stopped it. Then the knocking started. At first, it was just a faint tap, like fingernails brushing against glass. While brushing my teeth in the bathroom, even though I had no reflection, I still heard the tap, tap, tap against the mirror, as if someone was knocking from the other side. Startled, I spun around. Nothing there, but the sound stayed in my head like a pulse. The next night, I covered every mirror in the house with blankets. That only made the knocking louder. And for the first time, I heard a whisper. "Rachel, let me in. Open up." A woman's voice. Not Daniel, not anyone I'd ever known. The voice was young, but cracked like a broken string. It didn't plead, it didn't threaten. It simply begged, as if it had been trapped in the dark for far too long. I started digging for any information about 409 Hollow Street. Nothing on Google Maps, no records, no property deeds, no news, like the place never existed. I returned to the location. During the day, the house was gone. In its place was an abandoned parking lot, filled with trash and overgrown weeds. A homeless man slept curled up in the corner, eyes vacant, as I asked if he'd ever seen a house here. "House?" he repeated, then smirked. "That wasn't a house, that was a well." I shivered. He pointed to an old concrete wall where a section had been chipped out into a crude square. Inside, less than 2 meters deep, was a small round mirror, half buried in the dirt. It reflected nothing. I leaned in for a closer look. And once again, the knocking returned. This time, from behind me, I spun around. No one. The homeless man was gone, vanished without a trace. That night, I got an email. From a strange address, the sender's name read, LEH, subject line. You're seeing it too, aren't you? Inside, just one sentence. If you hear the knocking, don't let it in. Don't listen to its voice, it's not human. I once opened, and now, I'm no longer here. Attached was a video. Shaky, blurry, filmed in darkness. A young girl, long hair, wide, terrified eyes, stood in front of a cracked mirror. Behind her, something, a shadow, no face. Only white, glowing eyes reflecting the light. She was crying, whispering. It started with Daniel, then me. Next is... The video cut out. Night 5. I locked every door, turned off every light. Didn't let a single surface reflect. 2:13 a.m. The knocking came again. Not from the mirrors, from the front door. I didn't dare move. Then, a message arrived. It's me. Open up. I'm cold. Daniel. I almost cried. I wanted to believe. A part of me ached to see him again. But I remembered the video. Ellie's warning. The soulless eyes in the mirror. I stood there, trembling. The living room window burst open. A freezing wind rushed in, and in it, a whisper. If you won't come, it will. Then the phone rang. No name, no number, just one word on the screen. Other. I didn't pick up, but the knocking didn't stop. It grew violent, slamming, pounding, as if someone was trying to break down the door. I curled into the corner, hands over my ears. But then I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the closet. I crept forward, trembling, hand on the doorknob. Inside, pure darkness. I raised my phone, turned on the flashlight. No one, just a small mirror, leaning in the corner. On its surface, in dried blood, was a new message. You opened a door. You can't close it now. And when I looked into the mirror, for the first time in nearly a week, I saw my reflection again. But it wasn't me now. It was me, standing in a completely different room. No ceiling, no exit. And in the eyes of the girl staring back at me, I was smiling. I hadn't slept in 2 days since the last time I saw myself in the mirror. Not the me standing in the present, but some version of myself, staring from somewhere else, somewhere that didn't belong to this world. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself, smiling, with eyes so hollow it chilled my bones. I started wondering if I was losing my mind, or worse, if something else was taking over, some entity, slowly replacing me from the other side of the glass. I gathered what courage I had left and started journaling again, trying to distinguish reality from hallucination. But even that wasn't safe anymore. The next morning, I found the notebook flipped to the final page, a page I hadn't written on. And in thick red ink, as if written in blood, were the words, "You don't need to remember anymore. Someone else is living for you now." I threw the notebook away. I reached out to the only person I had ever known who might understand things like this. Sarah Doyle, an old classmate of Daniel's. Back in college, Sarah had studied ethnography and specialized in urban legends, mirror folklore, and spirits trapped in reflection. I didn't know if she still lived in Boston. But after a few hours combing through Facebook and Reddit, I found her, working at a tiny bookstore called Twilight Pages in the South End. The shop was dim and cramped, but Sarah recognized me instantly. "Rachel?" She looked up from behind the counter, eyes thoughtful. I heard about Daniel. I'm so sorry. I stayed quiet for a while, then asked, do you believe the dead can make phone calls? Sarah didn't laugh, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't look surprised. She simply turned around, pulled out an old book with a dark brown cover, and slid it across the counter toward me. Mirror spirits. Entities of the second plane. There are legends, Sarah whispered, that say mirrors don't just reflect our image. They're portals to another plane, a place where lost souls are trapped. Sometimes they figure out how to reach through, and sometimes they want to come back. I flipped through the book quickly. One hand-drawn page described a ritual called reflective replacement. It claimed that when someone dies violently or suddenly, their soul can get trapped inside their final reflection. And if the mirror isn't broken, they can try to call someone in to take their place. I looked at Sarah, who was now pouring tea into a chipped cup. Daniel? He called me at 2:13 a.m. several times. But now, it's not just him. There's someone else, a girl, Ellie. She warned me not to open it. Sarah froze. Ellie? Ellie Holloway? I nodded, heart pounding. Sarah disappeared into the back, rifled through a stack of dusty files, and returned with a faded photocopy. She laid an old Boston Globe article in front of me, dated September 21st, 2016. 17-year-old girl vanishes from mirrorless apartment. Ellie Holloway, a high-achieving student, had disappeared without a trace from her locked apartment. No clues. Police searched for 2 months, found nothing but a shattered mirror and claw marks on the bathroom wall. A chill ran down my spine. That night, I didn't go home. I rented a hotel room near the train station. No mirrors, no reflective surfaces. I thought I was safe. But then, 2:13 a.m., the phone rang. No caller ID, no name. Just a video, recorded from the front camera, of me, standing in the hotel hallway. I jumped up, ran to the door, flung it open. No one there. Only an old phone sitting neatly on the floor. Its screen cracked at the corner, but still glowing. A message appeared. Now you've seen it. I backed into the room, locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, turned off the lights. Then, the TV turned on. The screen flickered, static for a moment, then displayed a live view of my hotel room. Like a hidden camera was filming me. On screen, I saw a shadow standing next to my bed. But when I turned to look in real life, nothing. I almost lost my mind. Then, in the static, a face began to materialize. My face, but hollow, no eyes, no mouth. Just one whisper came through the TV speakers. You're almost ready. They just need you to say one word. I curled into the corner, sobbing. The next morning, I went back to Sarah's bookstore, but it was sealed shut. I asked around, but no one remembered a store called Twilight Pages. No one knew a Sarah Doyle. As if neither the shop nor she had ever existed, I spiraled. Couldn't tell what was real anymore. I returned home and searched for the one thing that might help me reclaim control. The first broken mirror. The one where Daniel first called me. I dug through old files, scoured abandoned property maps and satellite archives. After 4 hours, I found the coordinates. An old, abandoned psychiatric hospital, located exactly where 409 Hollow used to be. I'm going back there, tonight. Not to save Daniel, not to hide anymore. I need to know what's standing behind the mirror. And if I never return, smash every mirror in your house. Story 10. Steam that smells like burned flesh. I moved into my new house in the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, on a day in mid-September when the weather had just begun to shift into autumn, and the wind carried the scent of dry leaves. The house was a small bungalow at the end of a cul-de-sac, with a backyard full of lavender and a white fence peeling with paint. The first feeling I got upon stepping inside was one of cleanliness and order. Everything seemed freshly upgraded. The scent of new wood and fresh paint still lingered in the air, especially in the bathroom, which had been completely remodeled. I'm Hannah, 28 years old, a nurse at a nursing home about a 15-minute drive away. My life was pretty simple. I didn't think of myself as the type to be easily haunted. But there are some things. No matter how strong your reason is, you just can't ignore the creepy feeling that quietly crawls up your spine. It all started on the third day after I moved in. I clearly remember that night it was drizzling. I had just finished a 12-hour shift and only wanted to take a shower and crash into bed. The new bathroom felt soothing. The bright white tiles, the modern shower, the warm golden light. But as soon as I applied shampoo, I suddenly smelled something strange, a burning smell. At first, I thought it was the water heater, but when I turned on the cold water, the smell didn't go away. It wasn't like an electrical short or kitchen smoke. It was the smell of burning hair, strong, sharp, like someone had thrown a clump of hair into a fire. I wiped my face and opened my eyes. Nothing unusual, no smoke, no fire, just the quiet bathroom, the soft light, and steam rising from the floor. But when I looked down at the drain, where the soapy water was flowing away, I froze. In the middle of the stream, there was a clump of black hair, tangled and charred, hanging in the water. I frowned, bent down to look more closely. It was smoking, very faintly, like mist, but the burning smell was stronger than ever. I used a stick to pull it out, but as soon as the stick touched it, the clump of hair crumbled into ash. I stood there for a few seconds, paralyzed. There was no wind, no reason for burned hair to be in a brand new drain, and there was no explanation for the ash floating in such a sealed-off bathroom. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe some hair got stuck in the dryer, or it was just a subjective feeling after a long day. I cleaned up the hair, wiped the floor dry, and went to bed. But that night I dreamed of a girl standing in my bathroom. She had her back to me. Her long, wet hair hung down to her waist. Water from her hair dripped onto the tile, making a regular plink, plink sound. I couldn't see her face. But as I approached to ask, she turned her head, and I swear, her face was burned, deformed, her skin blistering like it had been scorched alive. There were no eyes, just two deep black hollows, and from her mouth, a whisper leaked out like wind. "Give me my hair back." I woke up with a jolt, cold sweat running down my neck. The clock read 3:03 a.m., and the worst part was, on my pillow, there was a handful of hair. My hair, black, long, and falling out in a clump, as if someone had grabbed it and yanked hard. I jumped up, ran to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged, even though I hadn't showered since the night before. As I wiped the mirror clear, a shadow passed behind me, making me jump. I turned. There was no one. I told myself, I must be sleepwalking. But as I turned back to the mirror, something froze me. On the glass surface, there was a black handprint, clearly imprinted. As if someone with a burned hand had touched it from inside the mirror. I called a plumber the next morning. A local guy named Carl, probably in his 50s, seemed experienced. When I briefly mentioned the strange smell, he wasn't surprised. Instead, he asked me, "Did anyone ever have a fire in this house?" I shook my head. The previous owner only mentioned that the bathroom had termites, so they tore it down and remodeled it. No mention of any fire. Carl checked the pipes and the shower. No issues, but when he opened the drain, his face changed. He crouched down, paused for a few seconds, then looked back at me, his voice low. "You should probably have someone come check the house. Someone who specializes in energy. You know what I mean?" I understood. Part of me had always believed in things unseen, but I never thought I'd have to face them that night while showering. I decided to try something. I brought in a small camera, set it on the sink. I recorded the whole process. Whatever it was, I needed evidence. As I turned on the water, the burning smell appeared again, stronger, like someone was burning hair right behind me. I turned around. No one. But the sound of water began to distort. It sounded like someone was shrieking, like skin being pulled apart in layers. I fled the bathroom in panic. I reviewed the video later. The footage was completely normal until the 12th minute. As I started shampooing, the lens fogged up, as if a thin mist had settled over it. Then, at the edge of the mirror, a face appeared. A blackened face, indistinct. But when I turned to look behind me, the face turned too, staring directly at the camera. I stopped the video. My whole body was trembling, and I knew this was just the beginning. I couldn't sleep after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, that charred face appeared vividly in my mind. Too vivid to be dismissed. It wasn't just a fleeting image in the mirror. It felt like it was watching me from somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't belong to this world. The next morning, I did what I should have done long ago. I called the real estate agent who sold me the house and asked bluntly, what happened to the old bathroom before it was rebuilt? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then he sighed. "Hannah, I don't think you need to know about the past. But if you really want to, I'll send you the final renovation report. Maybe it'll explain some things." Less than an hour later, I received an email with a PDF attachment titled Repair Report and Site Notes. The first line made my heart stop. June 5th, 2022. Body of a young woman found in the bathroom. Cause of death: third-degree burns over entire body. Fire source unknown. Victim: Alicia Morrow, age 24. No signs of electrical malfunction in the home. I had to read it 3 times before I could believe it. Alicia Morrow, the name set off 1,000 unanswered questions in my mind. Why did she burn to death? In the bathroom? And why was this report never disclosed when I signed the contract? I went online and searched her name. Not much came up. Just a short local news article. Young woman dies in apparent bathroom accident. Police found no evidence of foul play, but were unable to explain how the fire started. No photos, no public funeral, as if no one wanted to remember her. That night, I refused to enter the bathroom. I wiped myself down with wet towels and went straight to bed, leaving the nightlight on. But the light didn't help much when the clock struck 2:47 a.m. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping on the mirror cabinet door. Tap, tap, tap. 3 evenly spaced knocks. each one just seconds apart. Not loud, not sudden, like someone with long fingernails gently testing the boundary between two worlds. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, trying to convince myself it was just the pipes contracting from the cold. But then the knocking came again. Faster, more urgent. Tap, 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 tap. I shot up, unable to bear it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept toward the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. When I nudged it open, it groaned, long and slow, like it resented my presence. The bathroom was completely dark. The light switch didn't work. I aimed the flashlight at the mirror cabinet. Nothing. But as I moved closer and opened the cabinet door, a blast of cold air hit my face, and the hairs on my neck stood straight up. Inside, between bottles of pills and toothpaste, was a wet clump of black hair shoved deep into the left corner. It hung limp, as if it had just been cut from someone's scalp. I didn't dare touch it, but as I stepped back, flashlight trembling in my hand, a single strand of hair drifted down from the top of the cabinet and brushed against my cheek. I screamed and slammed the door shut, fleeing the bathroom like a madwoman. The next morning, I took the day off. I needed answers. I went back to the news article on Alicia Morrow, this time searching for connections, friends, family. Buried in an old thread on a paranormal forum, I found a post by a user named Blue Raven 89. I used to go to school with Alicia. Before she died, she was obsessed with a recurring dream about burning hair. She once said she woke up to find her hair smoldering, without any fire source nearby. She believed the bathroom held a spirit trapped in flame. I messaged the user, not expecting a reply. But to my surprise, a few hours later, I received one. Her real name was Riley, now living in Seattle. She agreed to meet me at a cafe near Tacoma. Riley was a thin woman in her early 30s, with tired eyes that looked like they hadn't known restful sleep in years. She sat down and got straight to the point. If you're living in the house at 1417 Rosefield Street, then get out. Now, immediately. I swallowed hard. But I need to understand, who was Alicia? Riley took a sip of coffee, then said, Alicia believed there was a gateway inside the bathroom mirror. She said she once looked in and saw another version of herself, hair soaking wet and scorched, standing on the other side. After that, her hair started falling out in clumps. Every shower, the smell of burnt hair got stronger. She began setting up cameras everywhere. And then, one night, she vanished from her own footage. No one knows what happened. The next morning, a neighbor reported smoke coming from the bathroom. But when firefighters arrived, there were no flames. Just Alicia's body, her skin charred black, and her face. She paused, voice trembling. Her face looked like it was screaming, trying to tell us something. A shiver rippled through me. Riley looked at me, lowering her voice. Have you seen any signs yet? I nodded, voice shaking. A clump of burnt hair in the drain, a face in the mirror, and strands of hair falling from the cabinet. Riley reached across the table, gripped my hand tightly. Then it's possible. You're next. I left the cafe, with Riley feeling like I'd just walked out of a funeral. Everything she had told me about Alicia, the mirror, the replacement, planted a deep, gnawing fear inside me. A feeling that death wasn't the end, but rather a door to a far more terrifying reality. On the drive home, I blasted music and cranked the air conditioning so cold my hands went numb. anything to stay awake, to keep myself from slipping into panic. But in the rearview mirror, I couldn't stop glancing at my own eyes. Something was wrong. I squinted. No, I wasn't imagining it. The face in the mirror, the eyes, they were hollow, soulless. I turned my head to check the back seat, empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was still staring at me, even though my face was turned away. I slammed the brakes and pulled over, heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I couldn't go home. Not yet. I spent the night at Jasmine's, my co-worker at the nursing home. I didn't go into details, just said something about my bathroom not feeling safe lately. She smiled, ever warm and welcoming, handed me a clean towel, and pointed to the couch in the living room where I could sleep. I lay on the sofa under a blanket, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind spun with images, burnt hair, a hand reaching through the mirror, and that reflection. That wasn't me. Around 3 a.m., I had to use the bathroom. I crept in quietly, leaving the overhead light off. Only the dim night light, casting a soft yellow glow. The mirror was small, with no cabinet behind it. I thought I'd be safe here. But when I bent down to wash my face and looked up again, my face was changed. It wasn't me anymore. It was a swollen, scorched face, skin charred like pork held too close to flame, hair wild and patchy, scalp red and blistered. I froze. The reflection didn't move with me. When I lifted my hand to touch my cheek, it didn't mirror me. I backed away. It smiled. A twisted, burned smile. Lips split open, revealing blackened gums and a few charred teeth. I screamed, loud. Jasmine shot out of bed and ran in. The bathroom lights flicked on. The mirror was back to normal. My face was mine again. But tears streamed down my cheeks, chest heaving in terror. Hannah, what happened? I couldn't answer. I just shook my head. She hugged me and whispered, maybe you need a place to breathe for a few days. For the next 3 days, I stayed at Jasmine's. I didn't shower. I didn't look in any mirrors. I felt like if I did either, it would come back. I contacted a man named Father Reed, a retired priest who now spent his remaining years helping those affected by things from the other side. We met at an old library downtown. He was tall, gaunt, and had the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen things no one should. After I told him everything, he didn't speak for nearly 2 minutes. Then he pulled out a weathered notebook and flipped to a page titled Reflected Entities. Sometimes, he said, violent or sudden deaths, especially those involving great pain, can tear a thin slit in the veil between this world and the next. If that tear happens near a mirror, and if the victim looked into their reflection at the moment of death, what remains might not be a soul, but a surviving reflection. I shuddered. A surviving reflection? I echoed. An entity without a physical body, but still conscious. It gets trapped in the mirror. And sometimes, it wants to come back through someone else. I asked him, and if it succeeds, he looked straight into my eyes. Then you won't be you anymore. That night, I returned home. I knew it was insane, but I had to end this. I had to face it. I cut the power to the entire house, except for the bathroom. I set up a camera, a flashlight, and prepared a small silver bowl filled with holy water that Father Reed had given me. I stepped into the bathroom. The mirror cabinet was closed, the lights dimmed. Steam from the running shower clouded the room. I stood before the mirror, took a deep breath. What do you want? I asked. No answer. Just the sound of dripping water. I opened the mirror cabinet. Inside, empty. But when I closed it, she was there. Not my reflection. She stood behind me, even though no one was in the room. Hair scorched, uneven, face deformed, flaking patches of burnt flesh. Her mouth opened, soundless. I raised the bowl of holy water and splashed it at the mirror. A hiss filled the room, like hot metal plunged into ice water. The mirror shuddered, then fractured into dozens of spiderweb cracks. A scream erupted, not from my mouth, not from any speaker or device. It came from inside the mirror, a shriek full of hatred and agony, torn from the invisible. The light flickered violently. I was thrown backwards, slamming into the wall. When I looked up again, the mirror had shattered on the floor. A scorched clump of hair sat silently. And silence. For the first time in many nights, I no longer smelled burnt hair. But I knew it wasn't over. Not for me. Because ever since that night, every time I look into a mirror, my reflection blinks one beat too slow.